Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. Breaking news. The Israeli military has just confirmed that the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has been killed in a military operation in the southern Gaza Strip. Sinwar, who was 61 years old, became the Hamas leader in August following the killing of the group's former leader, Ismail Haniyeh. Sinwar's death spells a massive blow to Hamas. Israel says he was the mastermind of the 7th of October attacks. Welcome. We begin with that breaking news just into us. It's been announced by the Israeli military that the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has indeed been killed in an Israeli operation in southern Gaza. Israel says that Sinwar was the architect of the 7th of October attacks, the deadliest attacks in Israeli history, in which 1,206 people lost their lives. All those attacks triggered Israel's military campaign in Gaza, which has resulted in the deaths of 42,438 people. Well, Sinwar's death represents a major blow to Hamas. Well, this is how the Israeli army announced the outcome of their military operation earlier on today. In a tweet, they said, during IDF operations in Gaza, 3 terrorists were eliminated. The IDF and the ISA are checking the possibility that one of the terrorists was Yahya Sinwar. Well, they have now confirmed that. At this stage, the identity of the terrorists couldn't be confirmed. In any case, that news has now been confirmed. The Israeli military saying that Yahya Sinwar was killed in the south of the Gaza Strip. Well, following that news, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant took to Twitter, declaring that Israel will pursue and eliminate each and every terrorist. That's the tweet that appeared there. Well, in his tweet, Gallant also posted some images of the former Hamas military chief Mohammed Deif, the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, marking both of them with an X, as you can see there on your screens. The third image, that one in the middle, which is blacked out, was thought to represent Sinwar. That news has now been confirmed. Well, unsurprisingly, the news of Sinwar's death has been welcomed by many in Israel. We're going to show you the moment this was announced by a lifeguard at the beach that Yahya Sinwar had indeed been killed. And there were cheers there at the beach as the lifeguard made that announcement that Yahya Sinwar had been killed. For more reaction to this, we can cross to Jerusalem and speak to journalist Noga Tarnopolsky. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya. Noga, great to have you with us. Just tell us what we know at this stage. I know the information's still coming in, and the Israeli military has only just confirmed that Yahya Sinwar is indeed dead. But just tell us what we know about the circumstances of his killing.
Well, we know 2 new things. One is that he was found by chance. The Israeli army did not have any special intelligence about his whereabouts. They were concerned about terrorist activity in a specific building. The building was shot at. Soldiers subsequently went to see what was in the rubble, and they found the body of Yahya Sinwar and 2 others. One thought to be basically his aide de camp, his closest aide, and no one else, as far as we have been told thus far. The other detail, which is, has had quite a bit of effect here in Israel, is that, in fact, he was about at the exit of the tunnel in which the 6 Israeli hostages were murdered last month or in late August. And the assumption right now is that when the Israeli army received information several months ago that he had surrounded himself with hostages, that it was those same 6 hostages who survived 11 months in captivity before being executed.
Okay, so as you're saying, a significant element of luck for those Israeli soldiers who weren't specifically targeting Sinwar, we gather. Fair to say he was public enemy number 1 in Israel, wasn't he?
Yes, I mean, I think he's one of the most wanted men in the world. He was the military chief of Hamas for, I think, the last 15 years. So since he was released in the Gilad Shalit deal, a deal engineered by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to release a single Israeli hostage who Hamas had taken captive. He became Hamas's military leader. He was known for his viciousness, and he was known in particular for his viciousness against Palestinians. He was the chief architect of Hamas's activities against those Palestinians they accused of collaborating with Israel.
Okay, and there was a lot of hesitation between the first reports and the confirmation of Sinwar's death. That was presumably because forensics were trying to establish that they had indeed got the right person, and certainly the early photographs we saw, it did look an awful lot like the person in question. Have the tests now been carried out? Have the forensics now been concluded?
To the best of my knowledge, the DNA test has not yet come back, but his body is being operated on in a forensic institute outside of Tel Aviv. The first official person to confirm that it was Yahya Sinwar, interestingly, is the man who was his former dentist. So an Israel prison service dentist who took care of Sinwar during the many years that he was in Israeli jail. He was the first person who, observing those pictures you just mentioned, said that for sure it was him. But even though we haven't yet received formal notification of the DNA results, I think that the Israeli army's confirmation that it's him, and now we see that the Israeli president has posted congratulations to the army on this achievement, that I think we can be fairly certain that it is him indeed.
We're expecting to hear from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Are you aware of that? And what do you think we're likely to hear from him?
I am aware of it. And it's a huge question because, of course, there are many in Israel, among them the families of the more than 100 hostages, dead and alive, still being held in Gaza, who say, this is it. You got your victory shot. This is the total victory you've been talking about. Declare victory and offer a deal. There are even, to my surprise, Israeli news figures, news readers who have said this is the moment to basically offer Hamas amnesty for anyone who's still alive and money for the hostages brought home alive. So there's a lot of kind of energy in the air. But I have to tell you, I would be very surprised if Netanyahu declared victory or anything like an end to the war. I heard one of his closest legislators, a man named Boaz Bismuth, who spoke on the radio just in the last few minutes, who basically said this is just another step in Israel's ongoing war. Okay, so
I was going to ask you, I mean, do people think we've got here a catalyst for bringing about a conclusion to what's been a more than 1 year long military operation in Gaza? It doesn't sound like, from what you're hearing, that is widely established as being a likely course of action.
Well, your question's complicated because you asked, do people think? The answer is yes. Almost every public figure I've heard until now has called on the Prime Minister to use the leverage that he has gotten by having eliminated this almost legendary and, legendarily cruel figure at the head of Hamas, to use this to end the war. Certainly the families of hostages who are now protesting outdoors in Tel Aviv are asking for this desperately, and many former military figures are asking for this. You're asking me my assessment. My assessment is that the Prime Minister is unlikely to go in that direction, but in Israel, there are a huge amount of people who are asking exactly for that.
Okay, Noga Tarnopolsky, journalist in Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed for being with us here on Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
For more analysis, we can speak now to the Palestinian academic and political analyst, Professor Kamel Hawash. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor. Just put this into perspective for our international viewers. How much of a death blow is this to Hamas?
I mean, what we've seen in the case of Hezbollah, for example, is that it took them a few days to regroup, and then they did. So it is possible that Hamas can regroup. The extent of damage beyond the killing of Yahya Sinwar today isn't very clear to us outside. There have been no independent reporters who have been able to, because Israel won't let reporters in, who have been able to tell us what is going on the ground, and they can't even tell you, this is the Israelis, how many Palestinian militants they have killed. So and we hear there's still ongoing action in Rafah, not only in Rafah, in Jabalia. So it's difficult to assess, but there's no doubt that any group that loses its leader, particularly someone that that group looked up to very strongly, it will have an impact. And they will also, and this is an important point, I think, that they will take some, if you like, a boost despite the bad news, that the guy was killed while he was fighting. He wasn't scuppering in a tunnel and was assassinated. He was actually, according to the pictures that we've seen, he was involved in fighting back, if you like, and that even the Israelis hadn't conducted an operation to actually kill him.
Yeah, it's interesting you draw the parallel with Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah, and as we've seen, as you've been saying, Hezbollah has managed to continue functioning without Hassan Nasrallah. There have been successes. They too have been killed. That's what we understand. In terms of succession planning for Hamas, who comes after him?
Well, it's difficult for me to say, to be honest, in terms of the names. We don't know who is on the ground in Gaza. We know some of the people who are abroad. They will continue. In terms of the political wing, there will be someone found who will be the political leader, if you like, of Hamas. That's for sure. In terms of the military side, Israel says they killed Mohammed al-Daif, who was if you like, the chief military person, but Hamas has always denied that. So it's difficult to know again whether he is around and still conducting the responses to Israel. But what I suspect is that there will continue to be fighting between Israel and Hamas people. Netanyahu can declare a total victory if he wishes, but he can't be sure, as evidence has shown, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. What everybody wants now is for him to actually realize that it is time to stop the killing, the massacres. This was a defining moment today, I think, but so was the images of people burning in tents while still connected to medical equipment that should have resulted in the world saying to Netanyahu, enough is enough. That hasn't happened. Maybe this is the opportunity to end the war for the sake of the civilians who are being targeted on a daily basis in Gaza and Lebanon, but also since one of the objectives now for Israel is the return of their people to the north, then this could be the moment, because all the various groupings outside Hezbollah and in Yemen, the Houthis and so on, have said they're engaged in what they are doing to support Gaza. If there is no fighting anymore, that will bring quiet to the north and also to other parts of the Middle East, and that can only be in the interest of people who can at least begin to recover themselves and their families and begin to look forward, hopefully, to someone saying, we've got to have a political solution now. And whatever Netanyahu says about a Palestinian state or his opposition to it, that is the way forward, and that everybody gets around the table and makes sure it happens so there is no repeat. Because what Israel must realize is the extent of hatred towards it has quadrupled, if not even higher, over the last year. And surely it must engage in something that reduces that hatred if it truly wants to live side by side with the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like you're particularly optimistic that this event is going to be a catalyst for an immediate end to the fighting in Gaza, but perhaps we'll have to wait and see what Prime Minister Netanyahu says when we listen to him in about a quarter of an hour from now. But let's just talk about the Hamas attacks and the situation in Gaza for ordinary Palestinian people. I think 100% of the population of Gaza now living below the poverty line. And I'm just wondering, given the suffering, the tremendous suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, just how much popular support you think still remains for Hamas and remain for figures like Sinwar?
Well, I think what I've been hearing from talking to people is, of course, people are worried themselves, those in Gaza, about being particularly moved from the north to the south and so on, from Jabalia. The messages that come out say, please pray for us. The Israelis are going to kill us. That's how they... So the blame is with Israel in terms of the operations it carries out. And I gave you the incident about the tents, but there are daily incidents where Israel continues to oppress and kill. In terms of their view of what they see as the resistance, the Palestinians will tell you they've been trying to negotiate with Israel for decades, and that has brought them nothing. And so, since they're entitled under international law to resist the occupation, then they look to people who will help them end it. The reality is, had Israel ended the occupation of Palestine before the 7th of October, the 7th of October would not have happened. And now is the time for them to say, okay, we have achieved our objectives. Let's get the hostages released. Let's end the killing. Let's not make any plans to continue the occupation of Gaza and to settle Israelis there, because we want peace. If that doesn't happen, then Israel doesn't want peace. Its status in the whole world, it's being delegitimized because people cannot believe what it's been doing over the past year, and therefore the best way for Israel to progress is to sit down and genuinely look at a way of leaving the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem and making peace with the Palestinians. Otherwise, this will continue.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm told we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us at very short notice. Professor Kamal Hawash, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
For more analysis, we can cross to Washington, D.C. and... Okay, we're not going to go to Washington. Let's speak to our next guest, who is, in fact, Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former peace negotiator for several Israeli prime minister. Thank you for joining us as well at short notice, hence my script not being exactly finalized. I just want to start by asking you a question I put to some other people we've been speaking to this evening and ask you what the death of Yahya Sinwar represents to Hamas.
I think it represents the death of an important leader, but perhaps more significantly in the mythology. Going into the future, Tom, it represents the martyrdom, apparently in battle, of this leader. And I think it would not surprise if it strengthens the resistance in the popular public imagination, because we have this mistaken assumption sometimes, we, I think, in the West, Israelis, that it's the leader. You get the leader and you've dealt this death blow, that you chop off the head of the snake. And it's a failure to understand that a resistance movement rooted in popular struggle of a people who are colonized and denied their rights and freedoms does not die with the death of a leader. If anything, as I say, it's a new lease of life in that popular imagination, because the conditions of the Palestinians are what gives rise to the resistance, not the charisma of Mr. Sinwar or Salah Haruri or previous leaders of Hamas, all of whom have been assassinated by Israel in the past.
So you're basically saying he's eminently replaceable. This could galvanize support around Hamas. But that does depend, doesn't it, on what's left of Hamas? Because from what we can understand, the group has been severely degraded. And if that's the case, I mean, it's not going to be business as usual, is it?
Well, I think what we have seen for some time is that Hamas that launched the October 7th attack is not the Hamas of now, but it is a Hamas that has cell structures that are more than capable of maintaining a guerrilla resistance. All this would be done with. Hamas has a collective leadership structure. It's true that many of the known figures in the military leadership inside Gaza are no longer around. That the idea that this is it, and it's, you know, we see it in Lebanon. We see this so often, the idea that you remove the leader, it's done. That, I think, is a very mistaken way of looking at things. So I think we will know soon enough, because I imagine that the Israeli prime minister is going to turn around and say, okay, now you have the opportunity, give up, hand in your weapons, hold up your hands, give back the hostages. Maybe he'll say in a very sleight of hand way, people of Gaza, we've freed you from these horrific rulers when we bombed and killed you for the last year. And we will see. And will Hamas give up? Will the white flag be raised? I very much doubt it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And as you say, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to speak very shortly, we gather. A lot of the new reaction we're getting here at Al Arabiya is focused on the hostages, actually. Germany calling on Hamas to release the hostages. The Israeli president saying, bring back the Gaza hostages, based on the news of the death of Yahya Sinwar. Do you think those calls to focus efforts on the well-being of the hostages are likely to be heeded at all?
No, because Prime Minister Netanyahu does not prioritize the hostages. Of course, he will say, my priority now is return the hostages. I've now created the pressure. But he will also set conditions which will guarantee that won't happen. He will say, I need to finish the job. I mean, I'm speaking just before he does, so let's see whether I get any of this right. I think he will talk about those who said, don't go into Rafah, those who said, don't take the Philadelphia corridor. Had we not have done those things, then Mr. Sinwar would still be among the living. So I think he will see this as vindication, and he will set his own course forward, which I think, to those paying attention, will prove that the inability to achieve a ceasefire is not a function of the living or dead status of Mr. Sinwar. It's a function of Prime Minister Netanyahu not wanting a ceasefire. He intends to stay in Gaza. He intends to continue being a wartime leader, and the US is not going to use the leverage and the pressure to change that calculation. So I don't want to dash the hopes, because it's desperate in northern Gaza, the starvation, the forced displacement. It is desperate to bring an end to this. But I think unless other things change, not only, but very high up on that list, American policy and refusal to use leverage, there will be pressure inside Israel. Don't get me wrong. There will be pressure. I don't think that's where Netanyahu is looking to move next.
In terms of popular support for Hamas inside Gaza, has that changed at all, would you say, in the last couple of months? And I put this question to a guest earlier, and making the point that 100% of the population of Gaza lives below the poverty line. I mean, the suffering, and you've mentioned it as well, of the Gazan people is something that I don't think we've seen in living memory. It's horrific. Have the people of Gaza made any connection in their minds or vocalized that at all, that their hardship and their misery is directly linked to Hamas's actions?
I would ask the following question to you. Would you consider that it's directly linked to Hamas's actions more than it's directly linked to the actions of those bombing in Gaza, the actions of those who placed a siege on Gaza for the last 18 years, the actions of those who drove out the families of Gazans in the Nakba of 1947 to 49, which is why when we see and hear refugee camps, what refugee camps? The Gazan Palestinian population are refugees because of the initial displacement. So I'm not suggesting that there is not a level of anger. That would be expected. But the real anger, I think the greater anger, will be at those who are dropping 2,000-pound bombs on schools, on hospitals, on residential buildings. And that's the Israeli military and the state of Israel.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Daniel Levy, really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we can speak now to the Palestinian politician Khalid Fendi, who joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Just first of all, where do we head to from here?
Well, I mean, this is frankly a huge achievement to the Israelis right at the moment, and Yahya Sinwar is a significant blow and likely throwing Hamas into disarray right at the moment and disrupting its leadership and its structure. So this could weaken its operational capabilities in Gaza right at the moment, and that will be affecting positively on a ceasefire plan, and that's what the people are looking forward right at the moment. People of Gaza are not really much concerned about the death of any leaders of Hamas, but what they are really concerned about the most is a humanitarian a ceasefire or just to get the aid in. So for the Israelis there is a huge achievement, but for the Palestinians there is another topic that they are focusing on right at the moment, and they've been trying to push forward since we've been through this catastrophe, this humanitarian catastrophe. So I reckon the death of Sinwar right at the moment would be a bit of an opportunity for the people to breathe actually, and for the international community to look onto Gaza from a different scope and from a humanitarian scope, and in order to do a bit of a ceasefire, a bit of considering what's going on as a bit of misery.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to ask you, we've been talking about this this evening with a lot of the people we're talking to, you know, succession planning in the ranks of Hamas. I mean, clearly they'd be prepared for an event like this. One would assume there's a chain of successors that's been put in place. They've thought about succession planning. But was there anything about the personality of Yahya Sinwar that made him perhaps difficult to replace? Was that anything strike you?
Well, from my perspective, I don't think there is any difficulties in replacing Yahya Sinwar. I mean, I completely understand when Haniya got dead in Iran. It was a bit easy for Hamas leaders to choose Sinwar as a successor, because the decision was made completely in Gaza, because we at a point we've seen there is a bit of detached in terms of policy making between Hamas in Gaza and Hamas in Qatar. So the one who has been always taking decisions for Hamas is completely Yahya Sinwar. So for the moment, I think there is a couple of successors that we can look at right at the moment, and one of them it could be Khalid Mishal. To be honest, he would be more in the middle, and that's what the Palestinian people in Gaza are looking forward. They don't want really to be run by people who are very far radicals or far right, and which really can make the situation more worse. So it's going to be an easy process to get a successor, and I'm sure there is a couple of candidates for Hamas to choose from, and obviously the leaders are not going to be from Gaza. They are going to be in Iran, and the only reason behind this is trying to be more approachable to the international community, and in order for the international community and leaders to speak to them way more easier than being in Gaza under this siege since 7th of October. So I reckon there are a lot of work needs to be done right at the moment, and one of them is trying to choose the right person to be replacing Yahya Sinwar. We can't have radicals anymore in Gaza.
Okay, well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. We're going to move on now, but thank you very much indeed, Khalid Fendi, a Palestinian politician. Thank you for speaking to us. Well, for more, let's cross to DC, and we can speak to our correspondent there, Simon Marks. Simon, I don't know if there's been any reaction out of the United States at this stage, given that the news is so new, but we understand that President Biden was informed because I believe he's still mid-flight heading to Germany on Air Force One. But nevertheless, this is likely to be a welcome development as far as Washington's concerned, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Tommy was informed of this breaking news while he was in flight, although the Americans had already said earlier here today, before President Biden left the White House, that they had been contacted by the Israelis and had been told that the Israelis had recovered a body that they believed was that of Mr. Sinwar. So confirmation coming after President Biden was already en route to Germany. We're moments away from a briefing here at the the State Department, also the Pentagon, has announced that it is going to be providing a news briefing in a short while as well. That will be the first opportunity for official reaction. Unofficial reaction, though, has been pouring in. Americans for Peace Now put out a statement saying the Israeli government, Hamas, the United States and all interested parties should seize this moment to declare an immediate ceasefire. This must, of course, include the return of all hostages and the admission of a massive influx of aid to the people of Gaza. It is worth remembering that this news of this unexpected news of the killing of Mr. Sinwar comes just a matter of 4 days after Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin sent that letter to the Israeli government, giving them 30 days to improve humanitarian access and take a whole variety of other steps to improve humanitarian conditions in Gaza, or else face the possibility of at least the partial suspension of US military supplies. We've also had some comment within the last hour from Mark Kansian, a senior advisor in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he's very much picking up on what you were just discussing, Tom. He says killing leaders of a large insurgent terrorist group does not make the group disappear. There is always a subordinate willing to step up. However, there are damaging near and mid-term effects for the group. In the near term, there is a stutter step, he describes it, in operations as the new leader establishes control over the organization. And I think when we do hear from the Biden administration, they will certainly argue that this provides an opening to advance those conversations about a ceasefire, the return of detainees, that the US administration absolutely believes Mr. Sinwar had blocked. And by removing him from the field of battle, they may think here, and we'll find out more when we hear from those US officials, they may think here that there is now more of an opening for those ceasefire negotiations to advance than there was just 24 hours ago.
Yeah, as you've been speaking, we've been getting alerts and all the latest on what Prime Minister Netanyahu's been saying. He has indeed confirmed the death of Yahya Sinwar. We'd already had it confirmed from various sources, but coming from the Prime Minister of Israel, that's obviously important. He also says evil has been delivered a blow, but our task is not complete. So again, that sounds like, as people have been saying to us on this program this evening, this isn't exactly being seized upon as a moment to perhaps draw a line under 1 year and a week of fighting in Gaza. And I'm just wondering whether you think this news of Yahya Sinwar's death and the fact that there's only a couple of months left in the Biden administration gives Benjamin Netanyahu a little bit more leeway in the face of that criticism you just mentioned. You know, patience was running out with Benjamin Netanyahu, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza has shocked a lot of people. But do you think Netanyahu will now feel he's got a bit more leeway with Washington, given that he's clearly able to say our campaign is working?
Yeah, well, I think it certainly helps Netanyahu in the sense that one of the criticisms from Washington, not so much from the White House, but from other figures, has been that the strategy isn't working, that you had not succeeded, as Israel had set out to do, in literally making a situation, creating a situation where Hamas was not going to be able to continue operating and being the dominant force in Gaza. So there is that opportunity for Netanyahu now to turn around and say to the Americans and to his critics here in the United States, you see, we were determined to keep going, and this is one example of why we needed to do that. But look, all of this is going to be another test of whether Joe Biden, in his remaining months in office, has any leverage over the Israeli Prime Minister. I mean, we have seen time and again Joe Biden privately and occasionally publicly expressing concern about the nature nature of the relationship that he has with Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying just a few days ago that no American president had provided a greater degree of support to Israel than he had. Nobody, he insisted, had been more ironclad in their backing of an Israeli leader than he had been. And he said Bibi should remember that. Well, the problem, of course, is that many inside the White House do not see an Israeli leader who does remember that. And that's why this 30-day window for a change in Israeli behaviour is another fresh test of Joe Biden's capacity to influence the Israeli leader's behaviour. And the disappearance for Mr. Sinwar on the scene, the Americans will see as an opportunity to try and advance those ceasefire talks and try and make progress in securing the release of those hostages that Hamas still holds in Gaza. But whether Benjamin Netanyahu will see it through that particular prism, I think is going to be a huge question that is consuming policymakers here in Washington.
OK, thank you very much indeed for that. Our chief correspondent, Simon Marks, in Washington. Thank you very much indeed. Just for the benefit of our viewers, we have had it confirmed from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Yahya Sinwar is dead, and he's also been saying the war is not over. Well, let's get more reaction, and we can cross to London and speak to the former British Defence Secretary, Grant Schapps. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. Your successor, John Healey, has said, I, for one, will not be mourning him. Would you concur?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a man who is, officially classified as a terrorist by the British government, who was responsible for organising and perpetrating a massacre of over 1,200 people, still have hostages held, and has caused turmoil in the Middle East, just at a moment when there was, I think, quite a bit of hope. We had potential normalisation with Saudi Arabia having already occurred elsewhere. And there's no doubt at all that his objective was to put a spanner in the works, send the Middle East into reverse. And he has, in many ways, was successful in achieving that this last year. So, no, I certainly won't be mourning his passing. And I do hope it's an opportunity for a new phase, because clearly everybody wants to see peace. I mean, everyone should want to see peace, but he was a big barrier to it, I think.
Yeah, we're listening to Benjamin Netanyahu speaking as we're talking to you as well, and we'll be able to have a look at the press conference that Netanyahu is giving. There is the Israeli Prime Minister live briefing the public about what has happened with regards to the killing of Yahya Sinwar earlier on today in southern Gaza. So that news obviously confirmed. He's also been saying the war is not over. Just listening to what the Prime Minister of Israel has been saying, Mr. Schapps, it doesn't sound like he sees this as an opportunity for a change of tack. He doesn't seem to be talking about diplomacy or negotiations at this particular stage. You wouldn't expect him to, though, would you?
Possibly not tonight, but I think it does change things. In the end, I think it would have been difficult for Israel to ever leave Gaza without having dealt with Sinwar. Now that he's gone, and indeed a number of his deputies over a period of time, you get to a point where Israel can say, well, look, we said we were going to go and make a real change. They can claim to have done that. And so, yes, you'd kind of expect him to say that. But I do think it actually does change. It clearly changes the picture on the ground. And I think it is important to grasp the opportunity to make this conflict move in a different direction, and one which ought to be towards trying to get a peaceful resolution to this now.
Sure, and I just wanted to ask you, because of course you were the Defence Secretary at the time of the 7th of October attacks last year, and did you feel that it was a matter of time before the Israelis caught up with Yahya Sinwar?
Yes, I think that's right, and we've seen elsewhere. The same things happened in Lebanon, that they've got the head of Hezbollah as well. And I think, although I hear people say, security experts say quite a lot, well, it's a matter, you can cut off the head, a new leader will come about. Remember, Osama bin Laden, who organised 9/11, was eventually taken out by the Americans, and it did hugely damage Al-Qaeda. And so, they're not the organization that they were. So I don't think you should underestimate how, particularly a charismatic leader like Sinwar, can end up being quite a big part of the story. And I do think I think the danger is underestimating how important this is rather than overestimating it tonight.
Sure, and as you've been speaking again, we've been looking at the Israeli Prime Minister on the other side of the screen talking, and one of the things he said is, evil has suffered a severe blow, as I said earlier, confirming the death of Yahya Sinwar and saying the war is not over. And just going back to what we were saying about, putting the clock back a year and to your time as a Defense Secretary, and when the 7th of October happened, did you imagine that here would be a year and a week later that fighting in Gaza would still be going on?
Well, I really hoped it wouldn't be, and I'll be completely upfront. I always said to my Israeli counterpart, you're gallant. When you go in, you have to understand that it'd be very difficult to leave, and that could be almost your problem. You could be permanently there. So I think the useful thing here is with the person, Sinwar, who orchestrated the 7th of October, now having been removed from the sea, it does provide at least the starting point to talk about how to bring the Gaza stage of this to a conclusion. And I think that is relevant. You ask how I felt about it a year ago, and I have to tell you, of course, it's been horrendous this past year. A lot of people have lost their lives. My fears were that it could be even worse, and it could still be even worse. We've seen Iran, no one's friends in the region, try to stir things up, not just by its own proxies of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iranian linked militias in Syria and Iraq, but also Iran firing on Israel as well. So we've seen, an instability created by this man Sinwar, acting as he did. And I don't think anyone should be in any doubt that his removal from the scene is good news this evening.
Sure, and I just want to ask you, you mentioned, and we've been talking about this incredible succession of events the last few months. As a new news channel, we've had no shortage of things to talk about, and there's been, very fast-moving developments in the region. Does it look to you like there is a strategy here, that all of this is somehow planned, or are you of the school of thought, as a lot of our guests have been here on Al Arabiya News, that Prime Minister Netanyahu is really shooting from the hip?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a great, deep strategy to it. Netanyahu has plenty of his own domestic problems. I think that there have been points at which it's become very stark, and then, look for other alternative routes through. I think the one thing which, from his perspective, he will say has kept us going is the lack of the return of the hostages. We did see that limited hostage exchange early on, but unfortunately since then, the hostages coming out have mostly been dead rather than alive, 1-2 exceptions. So no, I don't think there's been a grand strategy, to answer your question, but nor actually, just to complete that picture, do I think there was a grand strategy on the other side of this. My understanding as Defense Secretary at the time, and from the intelligence that I've read over the period, is that Sinwar was acting and behaving, although trained and funded, equipped by Iran, he was nonetheless, to some degree, just acting this out himself. And so I don't think it was actually a very broadly coordinated approach from Hamas either. And that's why these things are so dangerous, because when you have the lack of coordination in any which direction, the risk of miscalculation becomes enormous. And that's why we've seen, unfortunately, just some terrible outcomes from this conflict in this last year on both sides.
Yeah, indeed. And I've just got one last question before I let you go. I just wanted to ask you whether you think in a situation like this with Yahya Sinwar's killing, whether it would have been better for him to have been brought into custody and to have faced justice. Would that have been more helpful? Would that have been a better outcome, do you think, not least from the point of view of bringing about a conclusion to the war in Gaza?
You know, it's very hard to say what the counterfactual could or might have been. You know, here is a man who spent, I think, 22 years in captivity in prison in Israel, and in fact, he learned to speak Israeli, and it didn't do any good when it came to making peace. I think he came out in a prisoner exchange back in 2011, if I remember rightly, and it didn't do any good to Middle East peace. This man was not a friend of Israel, obviously sworn to destroy it, but he also wasn't a friend of other moderate Middle Eastern countries or Gulf countries, and was, very much part of the problem rather than the solution. So I would hesitate to say. I usually would say, don't bring someone in and have them answer for their crimes. But I have to say, in this case, as with Osama bin Laden all those years ago, there is a point at which simply removing them from the theatre, removing them from the picture, is actually better than what might have flowed otherwise.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, former UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we've been following the press conference given by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who says the war is not over. He's confirmed the death of Yahya Sinwar. He says there's an opportunity here for the region to stop what he called the axis of evil and bring peace and prosperity to the Middle East. A lot of focus as well on the hostages who remain in custody in Gaza. Let's speak now to Daniel Lifshitz, who is the grandson of one of the hostages, Oded Lifshitz. And we've spoken before, Daniel. It's really kind of you to talk to us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Before we talk about hostages, because I know there's a lot of focus now on hostages in light of this news, but could I just ask firstly for your reaction when you heard the news that Yahya Sinwar had been killed?
Yahya Sinwar is the arch-terrorist who brought this region to an awful situation. And I think really that now when he is killed, we really have the chance and the opportunity to a better future. We have a chance to end the war, release the hostages, and really bring some fresh air to Gaza and for all the families of the hostages and in Israel. I really feel that is something that can happen from today, and it's a new day from what I feel for this region.
Yeah, indeed. And the Prime Minister, who's speaking while you're speaking as well, has described Sinwar's death as, quote, an important landmark in the decline of Hamas. Tell me a bit about the latest with regards to your grandfather. I know he's in his 80s. I know you've said he's worked very tirelessly his whole life. He was a journalist, if I'm not mistaken, who worked tirelessly on the cause of the Palestinians, the two-state solution. Have you got any news on him? Have we heard anything since the last time we spoke, Daniel?
So, no, we have no news in the last few weeks, but he's an 84-year-old man and with a lot of medical issues. I do believe, that now maybe we get closer to a chance to get him back as the man who's responsible for kidnapping such an old man, women, children, is not with us anymore. And I really look forward to the massive pressure from everyone around the table. I mean, we got into a chance that it was really, we were helpless the last time we spoke, and since then nothing moved, and all the attention went to Lebanon and Iran, and now we really suddenly have this attention go back to Gaza and go back to the hostages and the war in Gaza. And I feel like now, before the elections in the US, it's a great chance for Biden, it's a chance for the Emir and President al-Sisi to find the person who will be now in charge of these negotiations and really bring those people back home. I mean, you see all those behind me here are 29 hostages still coming from the kibbutz of peace, kibbutz Niroz, who did everything for the coexistence and for peace, and since 2007 is suffering from rockets all the time from Gaza, but still with that believed all the time that a better future can come. And I hope today it's a day that we are closer to the release of the hostages, closer to end the suffering in Gaza. And I'm calling, everyone now have a chance. Saudi Arabia, Emirates, I really feel that we do have now this chance.
Okay, I'm sorry, Daniel, to cut you short. We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Daniel Lifshitz, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Yahya Sinwar, the slain Hamas leader, was born in Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip. He spent 24 years in Israeli prisons where he underwent brain surgery to remove a cancerous tumor. After his release, he rose to prominent leadership positions within Hamas and was soon referred to as the walking dead man by Israel. He spent years operating in the shadows before he would be named the architect of the October 7th attack. Sinwar was one of the founding members of Hamas and established its security apparatus known as Majd, which was responsible for pursuing and punishing those accused of spying for Israel. A graduate of the Islamic University in Gaza, he spoke Hebrew fluently and was known for his deep understanding of the Israeli culture and society. He later became a key leader in the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, Hamas's military wing, before taking on leadership of the movement in Gaza. In September 2015, the U.S. State Department designated him as an international terrorist. Following the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran 2 months ago, Sinwar became the new leader of Hamas.
Look back there at the life of Yahya Sinwar, who's died at the age of 61. Let's get a reminder of our top stories. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has confirmed the news that the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has been killed in a military operation in the southern Gaza Strip. Sinwar, who was 61 years old, became the Hamas leader in August, following on from the killing of the group's former leader, Ismail Haniyeh. And that brings you up to date with the world news, that breaking news of the death of Yahya Sinwar. Coming up next, Hadley Gamble will be here, then at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. That's a roundup of top stories, international news, and exclusive insights. That's it from me. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
It's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining me. I just want to kick off by getting your assessment of where we are today. We're going into an election season. These two candidates have widely divergent views about America's place in the world. How do you see this all panning out?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to start with where we are in the world today.
Yeah.
Where we are in the world today is we have more conflict, and more conflict that is connected than we have had at any time in my lifetime. We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're getting support from Iran and from North Korea. They're getting tech from China. Russia is giving a green light to Iran's attacks against Israel. And we have a pattern here where all of these adversaries see a reluctance in the United States and in the West more broadly to confront any of these challenges. All we hear is emphasis on de-escalation. We don't want this, we don't want that, we don't want that. We have to avoid escalation. That is a green light to countries to go ahead and use force because they feel they can do it with impunity.
The thought process, though, being, when we hear former President Donald Trump on the campaign trail, he says none of this would be happening if I were still in office.
And what's interesting in that, too, is there's a data point which is there weren't any new wars when he was president.
Yeah.
And I
so
think
if we're going for a fact check, that's
if you're going for a fact check, you better skip that one.
Yeah.
But the world is much worse than it is now. And you have with Vice President Harris a sense that we should continue in the same direction. We have to avoid World War III by avoiding escalation. Trump's perspective is we have to create uncertainty. We have to make our adversaries worry and wonder what's going to happen.
And it seemed to work for him last time
It seemed to work last time. And what he did, to be fair, is he had very positive signaling towards somebody like Kim Jong-un or Putin or Xi.
Yeah, as in I'm willing to talk to you.
Yeah, but he also put in place some tough policies. And
yes.
With Ukraine, for instance, he lifted the arms embargo on Ukraine. He wanted to sanction Nord Stream 2. He closed down the Russian consulate in San Francisco.
Seems to me like it was real carrot and stick.
Yeah, or at least a willingness to avoid personalizing the conflict with your adversary so that you can talk to them while taking tough policies and creating a lot of unpredictability. And certainly people here in Europe felt that unpredictability. So those are kind of the two models that are out there. Certainly, I would say our adversaries are concerned, or they're reassured by more of the same, and they're concerned about what would happen if it's Trump. Our allies, they're all over the place on this.
Yeah. When you come to a conference like this, and we're surrounded by folks coming from the defense sphere as well as the foreign policy sphere as well, in their kind of correlation, do you see them aligned?
Yes and no. Let's start with the defense crowd.
Yeah.
The defense crowd tends to have a fairly linear view of capability and resources and willingness to use them.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the way things work.
Yes.
And what they get from the foreign policy crowd is a yes, 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 but then no follow-up action. Like, how do you actually do that? Because the foreign policy crowd and the prime minister crowd, they don't want to actually have to spend those resources and get into a conflict.
Right.
So there's a lot of hesitation at the same time.
Right, and then the military crowd obviously wants to go to the defense industry so that they have the tools with which to execute if they're called upon.
Absolutely, and we've seen that we have so degraded our defense industry. We don't have the ability to produce the volume of weapons and ammunition needed in a conflict that Ukraine is having now to defending itself against Russia. Russia's able to produce more, and they're also able to access more. And we are not able to make that up in any space of time.
I think that's an interesting point because there's so much noise right now surrounding the support of Israel, for example, and U.S. weapons to Israel. Obviously, we have U.S. weapons going to Ukraine. Last year, I was at this conference, and I was told by the head of the Canadian fleet that if there were to be a conflict in the South China Sea, some conflict over Taiwan, simply we do not have the tonnage necessary to support any kind of long-term engagement there.
Yeah.
How dangerous is this situation for America?
It's very dangerous. We need our defense industry to be built back up and to have much greater capacity. Someone was talking to me earlier about arms control, saying, oh, how do we get back to arms control? And you get back to arms control by producing arms and making your adversaries wish that they had arms control.
Yeah.
that otherwise, if we're not willing to do it, they have no reason to accept any restraints.
Yes.
So that's the kind of dynamic that we're in now. When it comes to Israel, you mentioned this, I want to come back to it. Israel, just like our adversaries feel that they can act with impunity because there's no threat, I think Israel feels that it doesn't have any choice. Nobody has their back. They're on their own. So they're having to set the terms of reestablishing deterrence because the U.S. is not doing it. Yes. I think we would have been far better off with a more robust supportive policy for Israel last year.
Yes.
And hopefully avoided a lot of the devastation in Gaza and avoided a lot of the escalation of conflict now, because you'd have a more confident Israel and an unwillingness to challenge Israel backed by the United States.
How do you see President Putin's commitment, that 25 to 30% commitment above and beyond what they're already doing now to military spending?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. One, It's a huge commitment as a matter of national priority.
Yeah.
So it's 40% of their state budget is.
It's
going
a
to
war
go to
economy.
defense.
It's a war footing.
That's right. So that's one. On the other hand, it's about $125 billion, which is roughly what the U.S. and EU are spending on aid to Ukraine, and it's a drop in the bucket for us. So it is a commitment, but it's also scale-wise not as big a scale as it sounds like.
Yeah. Does this make the fight for Ukraine more difficult?
The fight for Ukraine shouldn't be that hard. We're making it hard by our own fears. We are governed by our fear of escalation, fear of nuclear weapons, fear of failure of Russia, fragmentation of Russia. Anything we can imagine that we're afraid of, we project onto the Ukraine conflict. Mm-hmm. We should instead look around the world and say, it's bad enough. We shouldn't be worried about those things. We should be worried about the current situation continuing and stopping it. And I think if we were actually willing to provide the weapons, provide the permissions, to start getting serious about NATO membership, getting serious about air defense over NATO territory and adjoining territory, we'd be far better off than we are with the situation today.
Yeah, and of course the fear there is that either candidate will put Ukraine on the back burner. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that Harris is going to be very much a continuation of current trends, which are not sufficient. That Ukraine is not winning. They're not losing, but they're not winning. Putin doesn't feel that he's been stopped in any way. He's determined to keep going. And lots of people have died because it has gone on for so long, and that would all continue. With Trump, I think what he's going to try to do is convince Putin, you have to end the war. Because if you don't, I'm going to unleash everything. And so you better do it now.
Yeah.
And I think that has a better chance of winning as long as Trump means what he would say and saying, I'm ready to push back.
Yes.
Not that I want to, but I'm ready to push back if you don't stop this war.
Yeah. What's your assessment beyond just this election of the fatigue? Because I'm a worst case scenario kind of girl. Because I look at it, frankly, I think of the foreign policy track, I think of the defense track, but I also think of the voters, and I'm talking about the money, how much it costs. And so when they see these big numbers and they're worried about their own, ways to make it ends meet with inflation, this becomes a bigger part of the story. I mean, it's literally about the bottom line.
It is. Everything costs money, but you always have to worry about what it's going to cost if you don't do it. We always calculate in the costs of doing something. We seldom calculate in the costs of not doing something and then what we're going to face later. Yeah. I give the example of Ukraine again. Right now, not a single American soldier is at risk in Ukraine, dying, anything like that. Same with our allies. We're not paying any price in terms of a war, not paying any price in terms of human lives. If Ukraine loses to Russia, Russia's right there on the Polish border with claims on Polish territory, Lithuanian territory, and Estonian territory, we are now at risk.
Yeah.
And we could have Americans die. We could have ourselves in a war defending our allies that we can prevent if we see Ukraine win now.
Tell me this, as a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, we now have a new NATO Secretary General. Mm-hmm. What's your take?
Well, first off, I think Jens Stoltenberg did a phenomenal job. Second, I think the job of Secretary General is often misunderstood. You're not the leader of the alliance. You are the representative of all of the allies where they agree. Yeah. So you have to
basically the custodian of that relationship.
Yeah, the custodian of consensus.
Yes.
Try to build consensus, and you can speak on behalf of the alliance when there's consensus. Mm-hmm. But you're a manager among many, many countries and interests rather than a CEO. So that's the job. The more you do it and the more successful you are, the more leeway you get from the allies. And that's exactly what happened with Stoltenberg, where he gained more and more authority over 10 years.
Yeah.
Rutte is now having to start at the beginning again and reassure everybody that he is going to be a good, reliable custodian of the alliance consensus. And he's going to have a new U.S. administration to work with. He's going to have some changes in European governments as well. He's got a lot of road ahead of him to build that confidence.
Mark Rutte is a person that I have interviewed on a number of occasions. We've talked about energy security. He deeply understands Europe's
He's a very
energy
smart
scenario.
guy. He's a very wonky, technocratic leader.
Yes. And also a good politician, one could argue, which I think you need to be.
Yeah.
If you're going to be, as you say,
you have to be
corralling
able
all
to
these
work
folks.
with everybody. His biggest weakness is the Netherlands, under his tenure as prime minister, never spent 2% of GDP on defense.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a hard sell to a country like Poland that is inching up to 5% because of the real threats that they're facing right here.
Walk me through those politics then.
Yeah.
That seems a bit off kilter, does it not?
It does, yeah. That he was. How do I want to say this? You have countries in the north and east of Europe that are looking at Russia as a real and growing threat.
Yes.
And they're spending 2, 3, 4, Poland getting close to 5% of GDP on defense.
Yes.
You have countries in Western Europe that say, well, yeah, but we have difficulties. We have budget deficits. We have healthcare. We have education.
And his country is one of those countries.
And his country is one of those countries. So they did not spend 2% of GDP on defense, despite now 12 years from the NATO-Wales summit in 2014, where everybody said they would.
Yes.
So
I remember that summit. It was cold.
This is a pretty harsh divide within NATO of those who are spending and those who are not. And it was not viewed very favorably in Central and Eastern Europe that he would even be considered for Secretary General as a result. On the other hand, he has very good relationships with people, as you say, natural politician, gets along well with Germany, France, the United States as well. So he got backing for his tenure as Secretary General. But now he needs to win everybody over.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I pointed out he still has a road ahead.
Yes.
Jens had that.
Yeah.
He had convinced everybody. But Ruta's going to have to convince people.
Excellent. Talk to me about this one. Okay, so this is a man who understands energy security. That's something that Ukraine, yet again, moving into what could potentially be a really tough winter.
Yeah.
How do you assess NATO's ability, capacity to support them?
Well, NATO's not an energy organization.
Very true.
When you look at energy security, there is an element to which you have to provide physical security for energy production and transmission. And we could be doing things that we're not doing.
Like what?
Air defense. The way Russia knocks out Ukraine's energy grid is through missiles and drone attacks. We could be doing air defense at a minimum, telling Poland and Romania it's okay to defend your own airspace so that Russian missiles and drones don't fly through it anymore. That would be already a step. But if I were Poland and Romania, or if I were in the U.S. administration, I'd be saying that you should have an extended air defense zone so that you don't face a risk of these dangerous objects coming within 100 kilometers or 150 kilometers of your airspace.
Yes.
So that no NATO territory population is going to get hit with anything. And that would benefit you, obviously, protect your people, NATO collective defense, perfectly legitimate. It would be with the permission of Ukraine, so no one should have anything to complain about. And it would have the derivative effect of providing some coverage over Ukrainian territory as well and protecting some of these energy supplies.
Yes.
So that's an example of something NATO could do that it's not doing. And that would help protect energy. But then the other side of energy security is building up energy capacity in Ukraine, linking it to the European Union, and cutting off access of Russia to global energy markets. We haven't been serious about this.
No.
We sanction and then we don't implement the sanctions.
Yes.
Other countries are just buying up the Russian oil and gas that Europe's not buying.
And I've noticed that there's a serious trend in the press that's only just now starting to be more realistic to say that these sanctions have worked when we who understand energy markets know that they have not.
No, they have definitely not. In fact, I was in Greece about a month ago, and they were telling me that when people thought sanctions were real, the mix of Russian gas in the Greece gas market was down close to 20%.
Yeah.
Now that people know sanctions are not real, it's back over 60%.
Incredible, incredible. In your mind, what's keeping NATO from doing that low-hanging fruit? Is it just fear?
Fear, yes. Fear. We are governed by our fears, not governed by purpose.
Yes. Kurt, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Hadley. Good luck.
Thank you so much for joining me. Walk me through how you see the situation in Ukraine today.
Well, I'm just back from my 4th trip there in the last 16 or 17 months. I think it's a quite challenging situation. Ukraine has had some very solid achievements. On the Black Sea, they've sunk over a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet without major surface combatants. So they didn't do it with their Navy, they did it with aerial drones that find the ships and then maritime drones that they made that have been sinking them. And that forced the Russians out of the western Black Sea, forced them to pull their remaining ship from Sevastopol, centuries-old port in western Crimea, and opens it up for the maritime export of grain, Ukrainian grain being about 25% of the world's exports, very significant. On the ground, they did the Kursk offensive, remarkable, achieved total surprise, despite assembling over 4 brigades of not just armor and artillery and infantry, but also air defense, electronic warfare, signal, engineers, and of course all the logistics required for that with drones over top of them. And they still hold not quite 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, though the Russians are now just finally responding. But it's on the front lines that the challenges are really most considerable. The Russians are achieving incremental gains on a daily basis, very costly for them, showing many of the shortcomings of the Russian system with just throwing soldiers into the line using human wave attacks, much of which the Ukrainians are countering with unmanned systems. They don't have the manpower, and they've got to generate more from their conscription process. But what they're doing to make up for that is throwing machines at the Russians instead of men. Drones. Also now starting to introduce ground robotic systems. They're going to have robotic dogs. They have remotely piloted vehicles, even remotely piloted machine guns. But again, the front lines are worrisome. And to enable Ukraine going forward, the U.S., the West, what we've got to do is help Ukraine change the dynamics of this war, without which no resolution is possible. Putin has to become convinced that he cannot achieve further gains at an acceptable cost. That cost has to be made just too high, even for someone who seems unconcerned by his own soldiers giving their lives. That's the dynamic that has to be changed, and it can only come about through a combination of different factors: continued EU support in aggregate, individual European countries, U.S. and other Western support, and the Ukrainians continue their advances in very innovative unmanned systems, additional drone battalions. They're cranking those out about every month. But they have to, again, increase their conscription and then training and equipping of individual soldiers for replacements, and then also new units that can capitalize on equipment, weapon systems sent from the West. That's really critical, and that's what needs to be the focus as Ukraine enters what is going to be a very tough winter. Russia has destroyed every thermal power plant in the country, has damaged or destroyed every hydroelectric power plant, and now they're systematically going after the transmission capacity from the nuclear power plants. So it's going to be a long, cold, dark, hard winter for Ukraine, and we also need to be doing everything we can to help them get through that winter. And there's a lot of effort ongoing in that regard.
How worried about that are you?
Very worried. I mean, this is tough.
And beyond that, how worried are you about the continuing support of the American people? Because obviously this has become an issue at the ballot box.
I think that there is very strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill in the United States to support Ukraine. Obviously, depending on the outcome of the election, we'll see how enthusiastic those in the White House are. But again, because of that bipartisan support, regardless of who it is, I think you're going to see continued robust support for Ukraine, although one occupant of the White House might be a bit more enthusiastic about it than the other possibility. But I think it's going to continue. I think European support will continue, even though there are cracks in individual countries, by and large, very, very strong. And it really comes down then to some decisions, U.S. to lift the restrictions on its longer range missiles that have been provided to Ukraine, accelerating the provision of some other items, And Ukraine, again, generating more in terms of conscripts and building out the actual institutions to do that. Because so far in the war, they've largely been employing those who were in service at the time of this latest invasion, and then those who patriotically came to the service of their country.
Tell me this, how much danger are we in from a nuclear reaction from Vladimir Putin?
I think it's unlikely, but I think it's something you have to be concerned about. And obviously, it's easy for us here to dismiss that possibility. It's much tougher if you're actually in a seat in the Situation Room of the West Wing of the White House. I've sat there. The responsibility is a lot more real, needless to say, although I still think that it has been overblown. Ukraine has blown through every Russian red line, and Putin has been cautioned personally and publicly by China and India. Both President Xi and Prime Minister Modi have said, don't do this. And I think that weighs very heavily in the balance for him. Beyond that, what do you do with, how do you use this?
Yeah.
The tactical
Where do you go
weapon,
from there?
It actually, where you go from there is you are this even more of a pariah than you already are.
Yeah, I was just in Moscow, as you know. I was speaking to Alexander Novak, the deputy prime minister. He runs the energy file as well as the economic file. You know, the Russians are touting their economic growth last year and this year. For them,
well, it's all because they're just plowing everything into their military industrial
You've
complex.
seen this report of 27% going to military spending.
It's even more than that now,
Yeah.
apparently this year. But, then ask the people how they like that as they watch their social services decline. In a country that already was not that strong in that regard, it has a lot of people on fixed income.
About the from an oil perspective with these depressed prices.
I mean, the problem, of course, is that they are still able to find customers for their oil, even at lower prices, to be sure, which is generally good for the world. Although, of course, the biggest producer of oil and natural gas now is, of course, the United States. So this cuts both ways. But no, you have to be concerned about possibilities with Russia, but they should not paralyze you. And this delay in deciding to allow the full use of the weapon systems that we're providing on Russian soil, when Ukraine is already doing that with its own munitions, is, again, that escapes me.
I want to ask you specifically about, in the last several days, obviously, the extraordinary feat by the Israelis in taking out senior Hamas officials.
This is unprecedented. There's never been an operation like this.
Is it something you could have conceived as former head of the CIA? From blowing up their pagers to their radios to getting them?
You can conceive of supply chain operations, and without being specific, we conducted a number of very successful supply chain operations during the war on terror and so forth, and other endeavors. This is just so unprecedented in its scale, scope, effectiveness, and just sheer diabolical creativity. Keep in mind that the people who had the pagers were the most important leaders in Hezbollah. That was a badge of honor, of importance.
Yes.
I'm sure they were fighting to have a pager. And then all of a sudden, thousands of them blow up. So killing dozens and then wounding many, many more. Yeah. And also rendering that particular communication system
obsolete.
Yes.
Almost immediately.
And then, of course, the next fallback was walkie-talkies, and they begin to blow up. Yeah. And they'd already stopped using cell phones because they believed the Israelis could geolocate them on those. So how they've lost their command, control, and communication system. They cannot coordinate the response to Israel in the way that they would have likely. And the big concern, of course, has been that Hezbollah had, at the start of this war, assessed somewhere around 150,000 various types of missiles, rockets, drones, and so on, which, if they could coordinate a massive quantity at one time, could overwhelm the very sophisticated air and ballistic missile defense system of Israel, of Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow, Patriot, and some others. And that's a concern. And yet Hezbollah has generally been unable to do that, in part because its communication system has been devastated, really. This is not just a decapitation, this is a decimation. Beyond that, Israel coordinated very quickly, right on the heels of that, striking over 1,500 targets and going all the way up into the Bekaa Valley, everywhere where they've been mapping Hezbollah infrastructure for many, many years, and simultaneous operations on an extraordinary scale with, again, extraordinary success. And of course, culminating a lot of that with taking out Hassan Nasrallah and also a senior IRGC Iranian official.
Can you say that, though, given the enormous loss of life, it was worth it to take out Hezbollah?
Oh yeah, I think so. Look, you shed no tears for Hassan Nasrallah. Those around knew where they were located. Again, this is tragic, but it is war. And when you look at what Hassan Nasrallah has done over several decades, including the Marine barracks bombing and many, many others.
But this is Israel's war, not America's, right?
Well, America's lost lives to Hassan Nasrallah's operation just alongside Israel, not in the remotely the same numbers. And of course, keep in mind again that Hezbollah brought this on themselves. It's their daily volleys of rockets and even anti-tank guided.
But Hezbollah is not the Lebanese people, and now they're dying in large numbers. They're not Hezbollah.
Well, again, the people in the area of Hezbollah, again, this is tragic, it's unfortunate, and they can lay this at the feet of Hezbollah's leadership, who positioned their facilities underneath civilian infrastructure and so forth. And in this case, I think Israel is justified to be doing what they're doing. I'm sure they mapped this out, I'm sure they did the weaponeering, but they had this chance to take out the kingpin, and they took it. And I think that was right, and frankly, I think it was proper, given what Hezbollah has done. Again, Israel didn't start this war with Hezbollah this time. Hezbollah did this out of sympathy with Hamas. They have denied 65,000 Israelis the opportunity to live in peace in their homes. They're displaced. And Hezbollah very much had this coming. Now, the question is, what happens going forward? And I think that what you'll see are a series of raids by Israel into the area between their northern border and the Litani River to dramatically degrade.
You don't see this as a ground invasion of Lebanon?
I don't think they're going to do that. I don't think that they want to get into an occupation, again, even as limited as to the Litani would be. Even that's still 20 miles or so, depending on where you are along that border. And it's a considerable territory. So I think that's roughly what they're doing. So this is a strategy of dramatically degrading Hezbollah's capabilities, not destroying them. And unfortunately, I've been asked by others, will this change the dynamics in Lebanon? Could this finally get rid of this this cancerous element in their society? And I'm afraid that's probably not the case. Keep in mind that Hezbollah is not just the most powerful, or was the most powerful non-state military militia actor. They're also a social service organization.
Provider.
They provide a variety of different social services, schools, clinics, governance, and the rest of that, really beyond the remit.
But knowing all of that, was it worth the loss of life to the Lebanese people? And I'm talking about civilians, women and children.
Look, no one ever wants to see innocent loss of life, but in war that is sometimes necessary. And in this case, again, this is not laid on Israel. This is laid at the feet of Hassan Nasrallah and the leadership of Hezbollah, who did what they did, knowing what the result might be. This is not at all, I don't see this as a...
The president came out and said, we're calling for a ceasefire. And now Politico releases a report essentially saying that Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein okayed an invasion of Lebanon.
You'll have to ask them about that.
But is this something in your mind that squares with America's policies? The president saying one thing and his people doing another.
Yeah, you refer that to the administration. I'll let them speak for themselves.
Tell me this. You say that Hezbollah will still remain despite this for the Gulf Arab countries.
Much diminished. And it'll take quite some time to rebuild it. Again, they have suffered huge losses, serious degradation, or leadership largely decimated. There are a handful left, we know probably, who will step up and they'll reestablish themselves. But I think what Israel needs to do now is even more aggressive action to keep Iran from being able to bring weapons systems, munitions, and all the rest of that into Lebanon, even, again, more than they have in the past, through the Bekaa, through Syria, and so forth. And they should be very aggressive in doing that. They can't allow this kind of threat to
What
be
about the
reestablished.
Saudis and the UAE? How does this all pan out for them?
I'm sure they shed absolutely no tears for Hassan Nasrallah. They are rightly very concerned about the lot and life of civilians and especially of the Palestinians in Gaza. And I've been suggesting publicly for since the beginning, that there needs to be a vision not just for the degradation of Hamas, but for the security of Gaza, in which Hamas will no longer have a role. But unless you actually secure that area and provide organized humanitarian assistance, begin reconstruction, begin the establishment of alternative governing mechanisms and provision of security by trained and equipped Palestinian security forces, if you don't do that, what you have is a continuation of a situation that is a humanitarian disaster and a vacuum. But actually that vacuum is being filled. And it's being filled by remnants of Hamas who will not be able to get the arms and ammunition and weapon systems through the tunnels underneath the southern border, because Israel is and should continue to control this. They should not give that up, in my view, despite what some are saying to get a ceasefire. I think they need to retain control of that. Nonetheless, Hamas will reconstitute individually in terms of soldiers unless there is security established and there's no longer a place for them in Gaza. And that would require, I think, incremental occupation by Israeli defense forces to provide security, and then rapidly thinning out and moving on to another area. Start in the north, come a mile in, east-west wall, a couple north-south walls. You have gated communities, just as we established in Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, and Baquba, and so forth. Biometric ID cards for everyone in there. Start humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, then getting a better life for the people, and then introducing Palestinian security forces that could likely be trained by the U.S. At the Jordan International Police Training Center and equipped and overseen. Then you can get humanitarian organizations in an organized way rather than this sort of haphazard way with gangsters taking over the trucks the minute they get inside the border. And you can ensure that Hamas does not have any governance authority in that territory, which is critical.
What do you see when you look at Iraq today? Disaster?
I see a country that Iran is trying to Lebanonize, but one that is not welcoming Lebanization, but has elements within it that are furthering that particular cause. So let me explain. It's a country that has had successive democratic elections and transition of power from one party to another without much violence. Yes, one of those took about 9 months of wrangling to get to it, but that is ongoing. It's a country in which you see significant Iranian influence, but it's also one in which you see significant resistance to that influence, and not just by the Sunni and Kurds, but by actual major Shia elements as well, who do not want to become the 51st state of Iran, do not want to see their country turned into Lebanon by the Iranian-supported political figures and militias having undue influence in the parliament and then also on the streets. But they're a force to be reckoned with. They're a big concern. They're pushing the government to reduce our presence over time and so forth. So again, there are some features that are really quite encouraging. The reconstruction, the economy is booming. There's corruption. Yes, there's bureaucracy. Yes, there's, again, undue influence of militias. But again, if you look at that country nowadays, it bears no resemblance to the Iraq that we knew and came to love during the surge in Iraq and so forth, with all the damage and destruction. You know, the road from the airport is now no longer the most dangerous road in the world. It's one of the most attractive in the world. There's malls going up. There's hotels. There's all of this. So again, it's complex. It's complicated. And alongside the signs of progress are signs of concern, or that should be concerning. But that's the reality of Iraq. And again, Iraq's neighbors should do everything they can to help Iraq choose its own course and not be unduly influenced or leaned on by Iran and Iran's agents on the ground in Iraq.
Final question. How concerned are you by the Arab Street? And I mean this in the sense that whether they support Hamas or not, or support Hezbollah or not, there is a great deal of anger at what Israel is doing in Gaza and what they're doing right now in Lebanon. Is it worrying to you that the Americans, by supporting Israel, have lost the Arab Street?
First of all, I don't think the Americans have lost the Arab Street. I've been out in the Gulf states twice just in the last, I don't know,
that's not
4
the
or 6
street.
months. Let me finish. Again, and there is legitimate concern about the Palestinians. There has been legitimate concern. I share concern about the Palestinians, especially in Gaza right now, given the damage and destruction that has taken place there and the fragile humanitarian existence that many of them experience. And just imagine the hygiene issues in a country where so much has been destroyed with no electricity, reliably, water, sewers, and all the rest of that. So again, they had to bring back smallpox vaccinations because that broke out again for the first time in just about anywhere at real scale. So look, I share the concern about that, and I think it's legitimate for them to be concerned, and I'd like to see a vision. I'd like to see a vision for a better future for the Palestinians in Gaza, and while we're at it, in the West Bank. Now, Palestinians bear some responsibility here too. They turned down Ehud Olmert's and Ehud Barak's and the Camp David offers many times, and they are in a much worse situation as a result of that. And I understand their fragility and also the political dynamics surrounding Benjamin Netanyahu and so forth. But again, I think the Arab Street should be concerned about it. I think it's a reasonable concern, and there should be actual. Not just a response to the street, there ought to be a response to doing the right thing, to again provide the vision for Gaza in the future that is lacking so far. Even the Minister of Defense has publicly called for this vision, and it has not been forthcoming but from the Israeli Prime Minister. It needs to. And again, if they can't figure out how to do it, just start in the north, go to the south, gated communities all the way down, learn while doing. You don't need a counterinsurgency field manual for that. You can figure it out trial by error.
Anger at us. When does this blow back on us? Because we're seen as supporting it.
I don't see it right now. I mean, again, look, the U.S. has always been, according to the Arab Street, the source of every problem in the region, and also, ironically, the solution to every problem. I spent so many years of my life out there. I have gone through this. I've experienced it. We'll see if this transpires into something. I don't see a great resurgence of Islamist extremism in the region, in part because, of course, we enabled local partners to eliminate the Islamic State extremist caliphate, both in Iraq and in northeastern Syria. And as long as we continue to support those partners, I don't think you'll see the capability come back that could extend operations into Europe, much less into the United States. Need to do more about the Islamic State Khorasan group centered on Afghanistan, which obviously carried out the operation in Moscow that did illustrate the capacity to carry out operations far from their base. That's a concern. But I don't see that particular threat the way as anywhere near as bad as it has been even in relatively recent years. I'm worried about it in Africa, but again, that's a much more relevant issue in those countries than it is actually, again, having an ability to carry out international attacks.
David, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining me. Madam President, welcome. You have elections coming up on October 26th. In your mind, will democratic values prevail?
Well, the democratic forces, the pro-European forces in Georgia have always been there, have always been the very vast majority of the country. They know where is our future. They know that we have no alternative. So I'm very confident that the Georgian population that has been for 30 years, despite the war that we were mentioning, despite all the attempts of Russia to derail the European path of Georgia, 80% of the population over the years steadily is supportive of the European path and the European future. The elections that we're going to have on 26th of October are going to be determining. There are many forces that are at work against the will of the Georgian population, but I'm confident that Our future is in Europe. Our future is also defended by Ukraine, as Ukraine is fighting for itself, for its independence. For Europe's freedom, Ukraine is also fighting for our freedom. And the stake of Europe will be determined by the outcome of the war in Ukraine, by the outcome of the elections in Moldova, by the outcome of the elections in Georgia. That will determine, for instance, the security of the Black Sea and the future of the Black Sea as a sea of cooperation, as a sea of peace and connectivity. That will determine the role of Europe in the Caucasus, of Europe and of our Western partners. That will determine the future of Armenia, which is now on its path also towards getting closer to the European Union. So everything that is at stake these days is very important, and more important than anything else, what it has at stake is peace. Peace through the expression of the free will of the people in Georgia as in Moldova.
And the free will of the people, at least with regards to the current government, seems to be one in which democratic freedoms are being rolled back. How dangerous is this new reality for Georgia?
Well, it's dangerous. We are the other side of the coin, that Ukraine is experimenting the military aggression. We're experimenting another type, which is the hybrid war, propaganda, pressure of all kinds, fear that is used, suppression. We have had this Russian law, which is now in action and tries to suppress the civil society, to restrict it. That's what is at stake in the elections. And again, I think that by the elections, the Georgian people will overcome these threats, which are very real. I cannot just minimize them. They're very real, but I'm confident that the strengths of the people, of the Georgians that have lived through very many pressures and fears and struggles to defend their independence and their European future, I'm sure they will overcome.
What do you say to many of those citizens who, as you say, they've lived through 2014? The West was nowhere. They see what happened to Ukraine and they think it's better to just bow down, get through this, and allow Vladimir Putin's influence to spread. What is your message to them? Because there are a lot of those people.
No, there are not a lot of these people, because Georgia has had many experiences with Russia before 2014, before 2008. It started each time Georgia was independent. It started in 1921. It was the same after the independence in 1991. So the Georgian people know that bowing down does not bring peace, does not bring you any form of accommodation with Russia, that it doesn't work.
And yet the current government, though, seems to be doing that.
Well, they're trying to, yes, that's the narrative.
Some people do support this.
Yes, there are some people that will support, although it's a small group that is more around these authorities because of privileges, because of corruption, because of pressure, because of compromise. We are in a situation where we see the replication of Russian modus operandi. And Russian law was a sign of that the authorities, because they cannot gather support any longer, are trying through different methods, through different laws, to really put pressure on the society. But again, I'm confident in the society because we have had enough historic experience to know where is our future.
Given that experience, how likely in your mind is it that Vladimir Putin would take military action if things in Georgia don't go the way he wishes?
That's certainly not an hypothesis that I will voice. And I don't think that Russia is in a position to try that, although you can never say never about anything. But I think that the strategy that Russia is using today in Georgia is to use what has become a proxy, which are the Georgian majority. The Georgian Dream has become really a proxy for Russian interests. So that means that their immediate strategy is not a military one. I think that Ukraine is enough for them. I hope so, but I hope that Ukraine will get stronger. I think that the answer to all these threats is really the solidarity around Ukraine, is strengthening the Ukrainian defenses and allowing Ukraine to win the war that they are fighting for us.
Remember, of course, that most analysts did not believe that Vladimir Putin would put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and yet he did. And to your point that you don't foresee this happening in Georgia, what is the plan if it does?
There is no plan if it does, because Georgia is not Ukraine. Georgia doesn't have the military strength. That will be another crisis for you.
We got a lot of them.
You got a lot of them. Yeah. So I think that we are not there, and I think that these elections are something for us to defend peacefully, and to express ourselves. I think that the mobilization of the Georgian people in the elections is the real answer today.
Speaking of it all falling on us, and I speak of the collective we of the West, what is your message to those today who would say, it's a lot of money spent on Ukraine, we want this to come to an end, peace at any cost?
There is no peace at any cost. Those of us that know history know that there is no peace at any cost. There is peace only when it's just. There is peace only when the populations have their freedom and when countries have their independence. There will be peace, and I'm convinced of that, the day when Russia will understand that, as any other nation in the world, it has borders it has to respect. It has to know, first of all, where are its borders, respect the borders, respect its neighbors, and accept to be in its own frontiers. That is the only peace that is a lasting peace.
What is something that we in the West should be doing to help Georgia at this point? Because you're talking about the strengthening, obviously, of democratic institutions, but also combating what is a major campaign by the Russians in order to convince people that their lives would be better off in that sphere of influence.
Well, again, I don't think that it's from outside that you can strengthen the inner defense of the people. I think that we have our history, we have our knowledge of Russia. We are more resilient to Russian propaganda than many other countries because we have lived through it. So people see through what is happening. I'm going to give you one example. A few days ago, there were, for the electoral campaign, big posters used by the majority, the ruling party, that described on one side the destruction in Ukraine, and on the other side similar buildings in Georgia that look very fine, and it just started a big uproar in the population because it was so not in line with Georgian culture, with Georgian tradition, to be gloating about one's peaceful living while the other, the friend, is living in this tragedy.
There was outrage,
it was,
and it was real. It was outrage, and it was real.
It was outrage, it was real, it was spontaneous, and they had to withdraw some of the videos of the same kind. Yes. They couldn't withdraw the billboards.
So your feeling is that all is not lost in this fight?
I'm persuaded that all is not lost. I'm confident. And I'm confident because I know the Georgian people.
Yeah. How concerning is it to you that one of the candidates for the U.S. election has said repeatedly that he wants to put an end to the war in Ukraine and he would negotiate with Vladimir Putin to do that? And I'm talking about Donald Trump.
I don't know. You know, once you are in responsibility, And it's one thing to say before a number of things, and the other thing is to, when you are in power, what is it that you are going to do? I believe that the American policy is very much a bipartisan policy, at least when it concerns Georgia. We know that it has always been a bipartisan policy. And I guess that concerning Ukraine, it will be a bipartisan policy because the reality on the ground is such that I don't think that any American president can ignore that and just give an easy win to a Russia that really up to now has been losing the war. Because for Russia not be able to win the war after 2.5 years against what it thought that was going to be a 3-day campaign is already a loss.
Yeah. Georgia is a tough place to be an elected official. You found it to be so in your case. Saakashvili is still in prison. In your mind, what needs to happen to the judicial system in Georgia?
Complete reform. That's in line. That's on the Georgian Charter, which has been now signed by all the pro-European parties, which commits to very early in the next months after the election to really start a deep reform of the justice system.
Because at this point it seems like a dangerous place to be a politician.
I've been impeached by the Constitutional Court, although there were 3 judges that dissented from that, which is already a reason for hope. So we have to do that, and that has to be done very quickly. And I think that very quickly also we have to, with our European partners and American partners, restart all the process of getting closer to European Union, of getting closer to American partner, to restart the military exercises that have been suspended now until the elections. We have many things to do, and I'm hopeful that we'll be on track.
Do you believe today that Mr. Saakashvili will receive a fair trial?
Well, the trial has been going on. There are many different trials. There is not just one trial. There is nothing that can be fair today in Georgia's tribunals today. Yeah. So he'll have to wait for the next.
It's a long time to wait. Finally, Madam President, just walk us through specifically what it is that Georgia needs from Europe and the United States today.
Support to the Georgian population, the moral support, because today there is nothing much in 1 month's time that can be done. Moral support to the Georgian population and lots of observers during the elections, because that's a way that Georgian population is going to feel supported during the elections. Even if the observers cannot really change much to the outcome. They are not interfering with the elections, but they are a sign that we are not alone. What is always the most difficult for Georgia, it's a small country, it's to feel isolated. Isolation is for us the worst nightmare.
Madam President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, the Israeli military says it's killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Hospitals in Gaza say they're running low on food and medicine as the siege of Jabalia continues. The US military carries out several airstrikes on Houthi underground weapons storage facilities in Yemen. And Donald Trump calls the events of January 6 as a day of love during a campaign event with Hispanic voters. Welcome. Israel reports it has killed the leader of Hamas in Gaza. Yahya Sinwar is believed to have been a key figure in orchestrating the October 7th attacks on Israel last year. Reports suggest DNA testing is currently being conducted on a body believed to be that of Sinwar. And this comes as the US military carried out several airstrikes on Iran-backed Houthi underground weapons storage facilities in Yemen. Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin said the US Air Force B-2 bombers conducted precise strikes on 5 underground weapons sites that housed advanced weapons in Houthi-controlled areas. Well, for more, I'm joined by retired Colonel Brendan Kearney, veteran of the First Gulf War and a former Chief of Staff for US Marines Europe. Sir, good of you to make time to speak to us. If we may, let's begin with what the US did over Yemen overnight. Targeting some underground weapon storage facilities. They said a targeted strike, this time from a stealth B-2 bomber that was flown all the way from Missouri to Yemen, and the first time one of those aircraft used in combat since 2017. That's 7 years. What does that signal?
Well, I think Rosanna, continues to signal the U.S. resolve in engaging the Houthis there in Yemen. They continue to cause problems, with the passage of ships out there. And the United States has clearly indicated over its actions during the past months that that's an intolerable situation. So those aircraft flying out of Missouri were probably carrying some of the very, very heavy bunker-busting bombs that can penetrate deep into the earth and obviously destroy anything that they're targeted against.
Yeah, and some analysts, military analysts, pointing out that those big bunker-busting bombs you're talking about, one of them the GBU-57, they can go so deep underground that this may have been also, of course, it's an indirect warning to Iran, given who's sort of behind the Houthis, but that it also could signal what the US is capable of doing over Iran as well, that it could attack hardened Iranian nuclear facilities. Do you buy that?
I do. I think there's a number of things. First of all, it's the practicality of using a weapon like that. The Houthis are not dumb people. They've gone ahead and they've buried into bunkers their weapons caches. And the United States, over a period of time, probably with the help of the Israelis and other of our Western European allies, have identified where these sites are located. So therefore, they become targets, and then they become engaged. So, and if you can go ahead and do something like that and also send a signal to the main sponsor of all the mischief in that part of the world, which is Iran, then so be it. Let them understand that they could be the recipients of this type of effort.
And I will come back to discussing Iran with you, because I know you've got a lot to say on the topic. But just on the B-2s, the bombers, the last time they did fly was apparently this 30-hour round mission from the US to Libya. That was back when they bombed an IS, an Islamic State training camp in Libya. And I'm just interested to ask you, I understand you weren't Air Force specifically, but from your military expertise, how those types of decisions get made to send such a sophisticated aircraft so far around the world to take out that kind of mission. So many years in between, this was clearly deemed that important.
Yeah, what happens is it's an analysis of what the target is, and in this case, you've got a target in Yemen, and you determine based on what you know about that target, the type of weapons that you need to employ against it. Then it becomes a question of what aircraft do you have or missile that you could actually employ against that target. And obviously distance plays a big role in that, but these bombers are extremely capable. It's a long way to go. They get refueled along the way. It's a very deliberate plan. But they fly from that Air Force base here in the United States because that's their home base. That's where they have all the maintenance facilities that are available to look after these type of aircraft. So it's a very deliberate decision. It's not something that's taken, easily. And they want to, if you're going to go ahead and fly against a target, you want to be successful. And we'll be waiting here probably for a number of days to find out whether they were successful or not.
Indeed, those battle damage assessments, as they're called, from the strikes are still underway, and the US military saying they don't currently indicate that civilian casualties were a part of those strikes. Is that probable?
You know, it's very, very difficult when you use the type of weapon systems that we're talking about to avoid civilian casualties. You know, when you look at some of the examples in other parts of the Middle East now, where there has been deliberate efforts on the part of, say, Hamas and Hezbollah to go ahead and locate their weapons caches in areas that are normally not struck because they're surrounded by civilian casualties. In these particular places in Yemen, you know, we haven't seen where exactly those targets are, but hopefully they were struck and there were no civilian casualties. I think that's what all of us hope for. But unfortunately, war is an extraordinarily ugly thing, combat and conflict. So if there are civilian casualties, sadly, I wouldn't be surprised.
And the Houthis, as would be expected, and very much the message that we hear day in, day out at the moment with everything happening in the Middle East, vowing retaliation for those strikes. What do you think that will look like?
Oh, I think they'll be firing some more missiles and launching drones against some of the merchant shipping and the U.S. naval presence that's just off the coast. They've been pretty consistent in the way they respond. There's really not much else they can do. You know, they've fired missiles, you know, at Israel as part of their response, again in support of Hamas's efforts in Gaza in defending itself. So, you know, they really have limited options. But again, they've been effective. They've caused casualties. They've sunk a couple ships. So we'll have to just wait and see what they do here over the next couple days. But certainly there will be a further response from the United States, or maybe even from some of the other European friends and allies that are also concerned about the interdiction that the Houthis are causing with global maritime trade.
Well, talking about things either escalating or de-escalating and allies or foes getting involved, there is a very important piece of news we must get to. But as you and I are talking, and that's evident from the sun rising behind you where you are stateside, news is still being confirmed. So when this airs, that may have changed, but news still being confirmed that the Israeli military may have taken out Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who is, of course, believed to be the mastermind behind the October 7th attacks and was a huge target for Netanyahu's government. We're going to have to speak in hypotheticals because we don't have that confirmation yet. But if it is confirmed, how significant will that be?
Well, it poses, you know, immediate significance, but there's, you know, this is the classic case of be careful for what you ask for. We don't know, at least the general public, including myself, is not privy to who this next follower behind Sinwar that would assume the leadership responsibility. He might turn out to be someone who is more capable, might turn out to be someone who is more evil. We don't know. But, you know, taking him out certainly causes a problem for Hamas. And the Israelis have been masterful here, not only in their operation in Gaza, in essentially decapitating the leadership of Hamas, but also against Hezbollah up in Lebanon. So, you know, those organizations right now are probably very, very much in turmoil in attempting to go ahead and determine who is their leader. And can their leader effectively communicate? Because apparently when they start to communicate, they become targets of the Israeli Defense Forces. And certainly the Israelis have been looking for Sinwar here since October 7th, and they may have found him. I guess we'll have to wait and see here until there's an announcement either from Hamas or from the IDF.
And you make that point there that, of course, Israel have been very successful in their own strategic aims of taking out the command structure of Hezbollah, one after the other, But plenty of people you speak to say it doesn't sort of matter because there will always be a replacement. There'll always be a deputy to move up the ranks. Is that what you were saying is possible with Hamas? Will this be such a symbolic kill that it could dismantle the organisation or not?
I'd be very surprised if the organization was dismantled. The organization has existed for a number of decades. It's a combination of a terrorist organization and a criminal organization. Some of their leadership are extraordinarily wealthy, and a lot of them don't even live in Gaza. They're off in Qatar or other places around the world. So I don't think it's to their benefit organizationally to go ahead and dismantle themselves. I don't think, they've got an awful lot of support throughout Gaza and throughout the Palestinian world and the Arab world. And there's lots of Americans that support them, as has been evidenced on some of the street demonstrations we've watched over the last year here in the United States. So I think, unfortunately, they're going to stay around. They're going to continue to cause mischief, mayhem, and the world is a poorer place because they exist. But I don't think we can just simply get rid of them.
So in terms of the way that Israel has conducted itself, not only in Lebanon, you spoke there, regards Hezbollah, but of course in Gaza, another strike today on this Jabalia refugee camp, killing and injuring dozens and dozens of people. Israel saying that this was a, quote, precise strike on a meeting point for Hamas and the Islamic Jihad group inside the compound. But of course, rights groups warning of an absolutely dire situation for Palestinians still in Gaza. Very interesting this week to see this leaked letter that the US wants to put strain on Israel and basically say, let aid in or you will not get military assistance. Did you ever expect to see that?
I'm not surprised this is going on. First of all, I think the Israelis, they identify targets, and Hamas and Hezbollah have been masterful in going ahead and surrounding themselves, with innocent civilians, making their headquarters underneath hospitals, in schools, in schoolyards. They've done this repeatedly. They've used non-governmental organizations as cover for themselves. So the Israelis, their intelligence appears to be getting better and better, are identifying where these meetings are taking place, and they're not going to let the fact that it's inside a refugee camp go ahead and deter them. And what happens, and again, this is a terribly sad situation. What happens is the innocents end up being victims alongside the targets of Israel. And, Joseph Biden has a terrible challenge on his hand because he and Kamala Harris are courting the Muslim vote, which is not insignificant here in the United States. They also want to support Israel. The same guy that here a couple of days ago sent the THAAD missile battery off to help defend Israel against what is perceived to be a series of Iranian attacks that will happen in the near future. So he's trying to balance this, and he's not doing a very good job, to be honest with you. But that's the reality of the American position with Israel and the American position in the Middle East.
Am I taking it that you're sort of saying he's fence-sitting? He's doing what he thinks is just the absolute necessary in terms of supplying the military weaponry to Israel, whilst also saying that, it's a sensitive issue and that type of thing?
Yeah, that's exactly it. He's, sadly, it's that classic case of trying to satisfy everybody. And oftentimes, in geopolitics, if anything, when you supposedly have friends and allies, you're supposed to support your friends and allies. And to go ahead and to publicly threaten the Israelis. And I mean, the Israelis should not be impeding the delivery of humanitarian supplies. But the Israelis also know that a significant portion of those humanitarian supplies are being taken by Hamas. They're not going to the people that they're intended to. And the Israelis are quite frankly, are furious with that. So, Biden is attempting to satisfy everybody, and he loves to project himself as being a tough guy, and he's not. He's a lame duck president of the United States. His vice president is running for president, and she also wants to appear tough. And it's a sad situation over there. And he, on top of that, he and Netanyahu clearly do not like each other. And that just exacerbates the relationship between the United States and Israel.
And at the same time, the Israeli military this week accused in a New York Times investigation actually of using Palestinians as human shields in some of their operations, and then also being accused by the UN of targeting UNIFIL sites in southern Lebanon as well. So coming under a lot of criticism and pressure at the same time, regardless of the huge scale of civilian casualties in Gaza and increasingly Lebanon as well. So whilst you're talking about the complex battle environment that they're facing, trying to take out what they see as their terrorist enemies and targets, and civilian casualties being alongside that, they're also being held to account for the way that they are conducting themselves. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the United Nations and certainly other nations around the world, many of them who identify as being friends of Israel, are condemning some of their actions. But again, as you mentioned yourself, a lot of this is done precisely because Israel is going after Hamas and going after Hezbollah. Again, this is retribution. This is revenge for the 7th of October. And in the case of Hezbollah, for the continuing rocket attacks that have gone on since the 7th of October, primarily aimed into northern Israel. The Israelis clearly are fed up. They clearly want to put this situation to an end. But I'm not sure, even with a successful military operation, that this will stop the violence that haunts that part of the world.
Now, just I promise to return to Iran, because I know you're very hawkish on Iran. And do you think, obviously with the US election happening stateside, that whether we see a Harris or a Trump White House, we will see a stronger stance on Iran heading forward?
That's a great question. I believe that in the case of a Trump win, we will see a repetition of his first administration in a very, very strong effort on the part of the United States government to deal with Iran. If it's a Harris administration, I'm not as confident. The Harris administration will be an extension of the Biden administration, which in turn is an extension of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration, quite frankly, performed abysmally in its relationship, in its, frantic effort to try to come to some type of agreement with the Iranians. And I think the Iranians played Obama masterfully in getting everything they wanted. And the United States, quite frankly, was played as a fool and continues to be played as a fool by the Biden administration. So I just don't see, honestly, Vice President Harris just doesn't have the understanding of the seriousness of the international situation. She lacks the depth of intelligence and experience to be able to handle these type of situations well. And I just don't see that improving if she gets elected. The Iranians, you have to give them credit. They've done very well in the way they deal with the United States.
And the Iranian foreign minister continuing his tour, I believe he was Egypt today, heading towards Turkey. He's also visited Saudi Arabia recently, clearly out there having those conversations. But do you think Donald Trump would therefore be a more masterful negotiator with Iran if you don't back Harris?
Well, I don't really view him as a masterful negotiator. I know that he claims that. However, I think his basic instinct in dealing with Iran is spot on. He doesn't trust them, and he believes that they respect force. He believes that they need to be dealt with toughly, And I think those basic elements of his policy towards Iran are spot on. And I think the world will be a better place if we don't need an additional conflict, but the Iranians need to be held to account. And they have been up to an awful lot of mischief in the Middle East for a number of decades now. And I think Trump will act basically the same way he did during the first administration. And quite frankly, I thought that was probably one of the most successful dealings any United States government has had in the last 30 plus years in dealing with Iran.
Retired Colonel Brendan Kearney, thank you very much for making time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Well, to Gaza now, where at least 19 Palestinians, including children, were killed in an Israeli attack on an UNRWA school that was sheltering displaced people in North Gaza's Jabalia. This comes as staff at hospitals in Gaza say they're running low on food, with the siege of Jabalia now in its 13th day. Well, for more, I'm joined by the Interim Chair for Medical Aid for Palestinians, Richard Makepeace. Sir, thank you for making time. And just give us a sense of the graveness of the situation for Palestinians in Gaza right now, as per the reports you're getting.
Well, I mean, the situation throughout Gaza is an absolute tragedy. I mean, 98% of the population, according to the UN, are suffering from acute food insecurity. And of course, the ones who will be hurt worst by this are the weakest, the children. And some of them will be developing life-changing problems simply because they've not been able to have food and to grow like normal children. Almost 80% of the population is displaced. There are mountains of sewage and effluent everywhere. And the WHO have been talking about 25% of the population suffering from severe intestinal problems because of drinking unsafe water.
And just so our viewers...
So, I mean, quite apart from the fighting, this is an appalling humanitarian situation.
And just so our viewers can be aware, what is it that your organisation does in terms of providing support?
Well, we have historically provided support to hospitals. We've worked with local partners to try to help the weakest in society, those with special needs, nursing mothers and their children. And we've also pre-positioned supplies in case of flare-ups of fighting, which unfortunately are a regular occurrence in both Lebanon and Gaza, and now increasingly, sadly, in the West Bank. And we're continuing, thanks to the amazing work of our all-Palestinian team in Gaza, to work on these issues. And I really cannot tell you how much I admire the fact that despite losing loved ones, despite being displaced themselves, they are still working for the common good. It's really amazing.
And how are the medical supplies going in terms of the stocks? Are you able to get deliveries in?
It's almost impossible at the moment to get deliveries in. And that obviously is extremely damaging. I mean, 50% of the hospitals in Gaza are completely out of action. And the other 50% are limping along with too little in the way of supplies. They don't have the life-saving machines that are needed for intensive care units or for premature babies or anything like that, even for effective diagnosis. They're short of the most basic things like dressings and disinfectants.
And something that strikes me, Richard, speaking to you there in London, and obviously I'm British as well, and there's a number of doctors that have returned from Gaza back to the UK who might have Palestinian heritage, but they are British doctors. They've gone out to Gaza to help. The stories they're bringing back are absolutely horrific, of course, of what they've seen. But is anybody listening?
The stories are horrific. And again, on behalf of MAP, I would like to say a heartfelt thank you to these brave surgeons and doctors who have joined our emergency medical teams and are still joining our emergency medical teams to try and make a real difference on the front line, as it were. But the stories they tell are extremely dispiriting. They can carry out operations and so on, but all too often the aftercare facilities are very questionable, obviously. If there's not enough food, if there's not safe water, there is a real danger that however brilliant the surgery, the recovery will not be as good as it should be.
I was reading a report from one doctor the other day who returned, who said there were just no medical gowns, no PPE, if you like. She had gloves, but that was about it. What type of a difference does that make when you're trying to sort of perform surgery in the field?
Well, obviously, you need an absolutely sterile environment. I mean, we take this absolutely for granted in our hospitals around the world. And that when that cannot be provided, that's not just a problem, it's an acute problem, because infections spread. I mean, as it is, even in the best hospitals, infections sometimes spread despite all the precautions that are taken. But if it's impossible to take precautions, then obviously this becomes a terrible problem.
In terms of starvation risk, if not starvation reality, because the head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees warning yesterday of the risk of famine in Gaza. At the same time, we're hearing the US demanding proof on the ground that Israel is not pursuing a policy of starvation, especially in northern Gaza around the Jabalia refugee camp. They say, quote, would not just be horrific and unacceptable, but also had implications under international and US law. Now, I appreciate you're not here on the political side of things, but just talk to me about the risk of the lack of food and what that means for people's health.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a huge problem for people's health. People need food to survive, and they need clean water to survive. And when these are not available, disease spreads, and of course people become progressively weaker. And the weakest, the children, become the most weak. So it is an incredibly dangerous situation. And when you have long-term starvation of this kind, you know, it's not just a simple matter of getting food in and people having generous meals to put on some weight. There needs to be a medically organized process to safely bring people back to having a normal diet. So there is a vast amount of work to be done in Gaza, and the only way that this is going to happen is if there is a full ceasefire.
In terms of where we head into winter, if there isn't a ceasefire, now, of course, pretty much everybody in the world wants a ceasefire at this point. If there wasn't a ceasefire and we continue to see this type of conflict heading into winter, Gaza does experience a tough winter, and some 345,000 Palestinians face catastrophic levels of hunger, is the UN-backed assessment of this. How does winter complicate things?
Well, I mean, the weather will definitely complicate things. I mean, it was not good, obviously, in the summer when it's very hot, but it'll be even worse in the winter when it gets quite cold. And, you know, quite cold is very cold if you don't have warm clothing, if you don't have proper shelter. And no, there is a real risk of an absolute catastrophe and mass deaths across the Gaza Strip. And we're particularly worried about the 400,000 who are stuck in North Gaza. The Israelis are telling them to move and trying to get them to move essentially under threat of fire or bombs. But A, there's nowhere safe for them to go. There are no safe routes for them to follow. And, you know, there is a growing perception that the Israelis are simply trying to erase the whole Palestinian presence in North Gaza.
And there has been concern that Israel is trying to pursue what they've referred to as this general's plan, which exactly is that, to sort of lay siege to the north. And they said, well, we've given evacuation orders for Palestinians to move south, but pretty much everyone I spoke to who is operating in Gaza or trying to support Gazans at the moment says they can't, there's nowhere to go. And it's dangerous everywhere you move, and a lot of Palestinians in the north don't want to leave. And interesting on that point, given that you work with medical aid, is this idea that, you know, some Palestinian doctors have asked for humanitarian corridors to various hospitals hospitals in northern Gaza because doctors don't want to leave their patients. They want to safely evacuate with them. I mean, how important is that type of thing?
Well, it's extremely important. And I mean, the most basic thing, if you're evacuating patients, is you need ambulances. And ambulances that are not going to be stopped at checkpoints or attacked from the air with drones or shot at by the Israeli army. And that means there needs to be proper coordination. And as I understand it, that's simply not in place. And even where there is coordination, the UN have found that on many occasions, I think something like 60 or 70%, the UN Secretary General was saying, of UN missions in Gaza have been blocked one way or another by the Israelis, and some have been seriously attacked.
I just want to ask you while we've got you as well, I appreciate that you deal with Palestinians, but you're obviously aware of everything else that's happening, the multi-front war that Israel's currently engaged in. Lebanon, the risk for cholera is very high. The World Health Organization is warning now after a case of the acute and potentially deadly infection was detected. Polio has been a concern in Gaza. I mean, talk to me about those types of infectious diseases and why they pose such a threat for people who are displaced.
Well, I mean, polio is a horrible disease. Happily, in most parts of the world, it's been eradicated, but it attacks particularly children with life-changing effects. I mean, they may never walk again. They may die. It's acutely infectious. And I note that the Israeli army were very quick to inoculate their soldiers. I think they were less helpful in allowing the UN to inoculate children, though I know huge efforts have been made. But I think this highlights the point that, neither Gaza nor Lebanon were in a comfortable state before the war began. I mean, Gaza has been under siege for decades, and there have been regular Israeli bombardments. Supplies coming in have always been strictly regulated. And there have been a number of wars over the years with big bombing attacks on Gaza. There was never enough electricity, for example. So, these were weak societies in terms of infrastructure and everything else before the war started. And the same is also true of Lebanon, particularly after the massive explosion in Beirut, which caused so much damage, and also the economic turbulence, which means that many people barely have enough funds to survive. So, add to that attacks apparently on civilian targets, attacks on UNIFIL, which is there because of a mandate from the United Nations Security Council, can only make things hugely worse.
Just finally, I want to talk to you about, and as we are speaking, these reports are still being confirmed, so we have to speak about it in the hypothetical, but reports that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, that Netanyahu and the Israeli military have been long seeking for in Gaza, that they may have taken him out in a strike. Now, as you and I are speaking, as this is recording, that hasn't been fully confirmed yet, but I just want to ask your opinion, Richard, as to how this could change things if that is confirmed.
Well, I'm afraid it won't change things. It's well known, I think, at least amongst the diplomatic community and also the military, actually, that you cannot destroy an ideology with large-scale military activity and bombing civilians. That simply doesn't work. The Israelis tried it in Lebanon with the PLO, and that didn't work. And they're now trying it in Gaza with Hamas, and I don't believe that will work either. If you want to defuse a situation of this kind, if you want to have a complete game changer, then you need to start looking at the real issues, which are about Palestinian rights and about occupation, and you need to start a process for a just settlement. I think this is the lesson of all conflicts, including one that was in our country.
Interim Chair for Medical Aid for Palestinians, Richard Makepeace, thank you.
Thank you.
Elsewhere, to the US election now, where during a campaign event, former President and Republican candidate Donald Trump was questioned about the events of January 6th, which he labelled a day of love. He made the comments when asked why people should vote for him when he waited so long to take action, while his supporters were attacking the Capitol during a town hall with an audience of Latino voters, a crucial demographic for the 2024 race.
But that was a day of love from the standpoint of the millions. It's like hundreds of thousands. It could have been the largest group I've ever spoken before. They asked me to speak. I went and I spoke, and I used the term peacefully and patriotically. If you look at the Democrats, what they say, you look at Maxine Waters and you look at Hillary Clinton and you look at what they say, and they don't put that on. They only put Republicans on. But they couldn't get me because of the fact that I said everything's got to be peaceful.
Well, the former president also criticising the Biden-Harris administration for the ongoing illegal immigration crisis during a town hall event with undecided Hispanic voters. The Republican presidential nominee asserting that Hispanic voters are, quote, most against illegal migration across the border.
A lot of the jobs that you have and that other people have are being taken by these people that are coming in. And the African-American population and the Hispanic population in particular are losing jobs now because millions of people are coming in. So they're coming in, but they're also coming in largely, and tremendous numbers coming in out of mental institutions. They're emptying out mental institutions. They're emptying out insane asylums. That's a step above a mental institution. Worse, bigger problems.
Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris engaged in a heated discussion with Fox News, stating her presidency would differ significantly from President Joe Biden's.
My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. And like every new president that comes into office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas. I represent a new generation of leadership. I, for example, am someone who has not spent the majority of my career in Washington, D.C. I invite ideas, whether it be from the Republicans who are supporting me, who were just on stage with me minutes ago, and the business sector, and others who can contribute to the decisions that I make.
Well, for more, I'm joined by the chair of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. Greg, thanks so much for making time for us. And given, you're the chair of the Republican Overseas UK, let's start by talking about Donald Trump's performance in his Univision town hall there in Florida. It's fair to say he faced some tough questions from the crowd. How do you think he handled it all?
I think he handled it pretty well. I mean, he's somewhat inconsistent and sometimes unfiltered, to say the least. But I think he handled it well. He's doing very well with Hispanics, specifically in Florida, but he's doing well overall with Hispanics. If you compare, his distance with Hispanics, African Americans, as well as even young people, compared to the advantages that Hillary Clinton had in 2016 and Joe Biden had in 2020, that gap is really narrowed. And in many of the swing states, he actually leads with Hispanics. So this is kind of a new era in terms of the Democrats' dependency on identity groups. If they don't win those identity groups by the same margins they have in the past, it could be real trouble for them. So I thought he handled it pretty well.
You're right. We've seen him speak to roomfuls of black voters, roomfuls of Hispanic voters. This one, a particularly tough question, came from somebody who says they pick basically sort of fruits and vegetables in the US. And they said there are workers, and if Trump was to get rid of migrant farm workers, who else would there be to do that type of work? He's obviously talking about the illegally migrant workers. Now, some are saying Trump didn't directly respond to that question. He just spoke about illegals in general. Don't you think it was a fair question to ask, though?
I do, and sometimes I wish President Trump would just answer the question simply, and we could say that about many politicians, but I think he had an opportunity there to clarify the difference between legal and illegal. And the shame is it's a human rights tragedy as well. The illegal migrants have virtually no bargaining power, no ability to unionize and join the organizations that in many ways can protect them. So I think it's really it makes the companies, the agriculture companies that hire illegal migrants to blame as well. And I think that we need to remind people that it's not only difficult because it lowers wages and makes things more difficult for American workers, including immigrants, but also point out that it makes it really challenging for these illegals to have any bargaining power.
Now, elsewhere, another very testy question he got was about his response to the events that happened on January 6th. And somebody saying, I couldn't vote for you again based on the way that you handled those events. Trump coming out then and saying, well, it was a day of support for me. He actually referred to it as a day of love. Do you think that's going to help him?
I don't know that it will help him. It's a difficult topic, obviously. That the January 6th was, a disgrace on so many measures, so many metrics. And so I think it's a difficult one for him. He does try to remind people that, many of the people in Washington on that day were indeed, protesting peacefully and patriotically, which is something he indicated on that day. So I don't know how he ever turns that into a winner. But it's also one that he has to handle delicately. I don't think you get some of those voters back, no matter what. I think, we probably lost, a single-digit percentage of even Republican voters that just, found that to be unpalatable. And so he's doing his best, I think, to address it and remind people that there were plenty of good people there in Washington on that day.
In terms of talking about winners and Republicans who can't back what they see as the indefensible, somebody else in the audience I believe it was at the Univision event in Florida, standing up and saying, why should we back you when plenty of Republicans won't back you? They've turned their backs on you. They've almost defected. How to handle that?
Well, I think, he would do better to remind people that plenty of Democrats have come over to the Republican side and actually are supporting him. If you consider RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, as well as Elon Musk and even, hedge fund managers like Bill Ackman, who's a lifelong Democrat and continues to identify as a Democrat. But, so I think it's happening on both sides. It sort of indicates the realignment of the parties that, the Republicans are now the party of the working class and the Democrats are more the party of the elites and, the coastal elites. And I think that's relatively new. I mean, that's only in the last 10 or so years. So it just points to the realignment. Many of the Republicans that have supported Trump publicly also have some personal baggage, right? I mean, obviously, Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, there's no love lost between those families. And so, there's a bit of personal in some of those endorsements. I don't know that that Liz Cheney can go on talking about the Constitution and saving the Constitution or saving democracy when so many of the things that Kamala Harris wants to do are in direct conflict with constitutional norms, like stacking the Supreme Court or eliminating the filibuster, eliminating the Electoral College. So I think, President Trump could do a better job of articulating that. I think J.D. Vance does a much better job of articulating that message.
Let's think for a moment about women's issues, if we like to put it that way. But Trump calling himself the father of IVF, and others pointing out, and we will get to Harris and her appearance on Fox News, that she didn't really corner the sort of women's issue side of things in a way that she could. Is Trump trying to get more women over to his camp?
I think so, because right now, according to the polls, the women favor. It's a massive gender difference between Trump and Kamala, and so Trump has a lot of room to catch up. He has a lot of opportunity because right now so many women, especially single women, are supporting Kamala Harris. And I think he's got plenty of upside there, to say the least. And I think he has some good arguments to make. He's not as pro-life as many of us conservatives would like. He's definitely tilted to the center on that. The Republican message in general, and it's even in the documents that came out of the convention, are indicating that the party is very much against late-term abortion or third trimester abortion, but not necessarily against abortion in the first trimester. So I think that's very new for Republicans, and I don't think they've done a great job of articulating that. But the current Democrat policy is, taxpayer funded up until birth. That's not the party of Bill Clinton, safe, legal, and rare. So that's kind of a message that there's a bit of room to basically re-argue that point, but also on other women's issues, starting with inflation. Many women, especially mothers, are having problems putting food on the table, putting petrol in their cars. That's the number one issue for Americans right now is inflation and the economy. Trump leads by 10 points on the economy and 12 points on inflation over Kamala. And then, of course, you have the border crisis, which really affects women. The amount of forced prostitution, sex trafficking, we've based the Biden and Harris administration in many ways have turned over border security to the human and drug trafficking cartels. That's a big women's issue. I think he needs to do a better job of articulating that. And then, of course, you have the cultural things like women's sports being compromised by trans men. That's something that really hits home, especially with the suburban mothers. And I would rank that as an issue that benefits Trump in this election. So, there's a lot of things that are specifically women's issues that he could do a better job of articulating.
And certainly his running mate, his deputy, J.D. Vance, singling out childless single cat ladies, that didn't go down so well earlier on in the race. And you mentioned there that Harris very much has the single female voter on the side, on the Democrat side, but her appearance on Fox News was in large part to try and win over the Republican, the conservative female voter, the ones you're talking about there, especially the suburban mum types who are concerned about immigration, who might typically vote Republican. So do you think she was at all successful in that?
I don't think so. And I'm not just from watching it. It was a really hard segment to watch, real difficult. I almost felt sorry for her at the end, but wasn't quite the disaster that the Biden June 27th debate was with Trump that really, in effect, ended Biden's nomination. But it wasn't great. I don't think she was able to sway any undecideds or especially Republican women over to support her because she didn't really answer any of the questions. And so, I was surprised she did it. I think it shows that there's a bit of desperation or at least concern in the Harris campaign. And it really, the timing was odd too. She did not have a good appearance with The View, which is obviously very, very left leaning, nor did she with 60 Minutes, which is also, fairly left leaning. So she's had a difficult time in the press as she's doing more press interviews. And this wasn't a good moment for her. I don't think it was a winning moment for her at all.
Why did you find it a difficult watch? Because those on her side said that she had a very difficult time with Bret Baier, the host, the Fox News host, that he was constantly talking over her and interrupting, but you didn't get that sense.
Well, I think he was forced to because she just wouldn't answer the question. Every question about big issues, top issues for American voters, she replied with Trump, and everything was about Trump, and without really addressing, the border policies. I thought that was the most obvious one. And I think, this is a moment where, she could have really addressed those issues. She's really conflicted because on one hand, on the interview with The View, she basically said she wouldn't do anything differently and that she was in the room for every major decision. And then last night on Fox, she was trying to say, we're turning the page. I'm not Joe Biden. Let's turn the page and move forward. I'm not sure that she's handled that perfectly because it's going to be really difficult for her to separate herself from the decisions that have been so unfortunate and the outcomes have been so difficult made life very difficult for American voters. So I thought it was an opportunity for her. I thought it was very good of her to agree to do the interview, even though I was surprised. But I think it's the point where, there's that moment where you just can't deny the obvious anymore. We, of course, saw that on June 27th with Biden, but I think we saw a little bit of that last night, that we can't deny that she, does not instill confidence in having vision or even aptitude for it. So, and again, I'll just go back to J.D. Vance for a minute. He's actually shown to be much more articulate at delivering the message. You saw that in the debate. And I think some of his past mistakes, like the cat lady comment, granted, that was years ago, 2021, I believe. But I think in the debate with Tim Walz, he really gave permission for suburban women to vote for Trump. I think that was a real turning point in the debate. And I think if both candidates can articulate that women can indeed, if they look past, the one issue that Democrats are trying to to make a top issue, which is abortion. But this is a party of it's gone from pro-choice to pro-abortion. And I think there's a difference there. So if that could be articulated better, and JD started with that in his debate with Waltz, and I think they should continue that. And there's a lot of room to get both single and married women to vote for Trump.
The polls, the national average of the polls, do tend to continue to be very, very tight indeed, with Harris maintaining just a very slight lead over Trump. Now, in terms of there only being a few days left, really, until the election, so just over 2 weeks to go, I mean, what could happen? Is it all still to play for?
Yeah, I think there could always be an October surprise. I mean, we've had about 5 of them already in this campaign. Such massive events like the assassination attempts and again, the June 27th debate, dropping Biden and installing Kamala Harris as the candidate. These are all relatively unprecedented moments. So yes, there could be another one, but the trend is pretty good for Trump. Even a week ago, it felt like a real dead heat, but in the last few days, the most recent polls are showing Trump really strong in the swing states, and even a couple have come out with him leading nationally. So, the real clear average is still basically a dead heat. All the swing states are well within the margin of error, probably within a point. But I think that the trend is definitely toward President Trump. Vice President Harris has just had a difficult 2 weeks with some missteps and with some of the media appearances. And I think last night was just another one.
Look, you're speaking to us, I believe, from Dublin today, but you are based normally in the UK. What are Republicans overseas saying? Are they feeling confident?
Yeah, there's a great confidence. I think if the election was tomorrow, given the recent polls and the trend, I think President Trump would win. The challenge is the Democrats are really good at getting out the vote. They've been doing this for generations, but they did it especially well in 2020 with the mail-in voting and in 2022 in the midterms. And they're just really good at ballot harvesting and doing the door-to-door work. The Republicans are doing that, that's for sure. We're just playing a little catch-up there. So I think the great risk for the Republicans right now, both in the presidential race and even down the ballot, is to get out the vote machine of the Democrats. We are doing it. We are sending volunteers into the swing states and poll watchers as well. So, but that's I think the one great advantage they have. Kamala Harris has raised $1 billion since she was made the nominee. So she's far out spending and far out raising the Republicans. So they have that money advantage, which translates quite often into that ground game. But again, Republicans, we are trying, we are doing it. The Republicans in the UK are really enthused about this election. And I think we'll see a much higher turnout than we have historically.
What does that $75 million cash injection from Elon Musk into Trump's sort of campaign and the wider Republican campaign mean in terms of actual impact?
Yeah, I think it will. Every little bit helps. And I think what you'll see is two things. I don't think it'll translate into a massive advertising spend. And there's a reason for that. The Harris campaign spent $240 million in the swing states in the last few months versus $104 million for the Trump campaign, and yet the needle did not move. If anything, Harris went down in the polls. So I don't think advertising is going to do it. They did post the Bret Baier interview, the Fox interview. The Trump campaign posted that last night, and they called it our latest campaign ad. I thought that was pretty funny, but also it's free. It doesn't cost anything. So that probably works better than advertising. Where they will put the money is in the ground game. It's hiring volunteers or transporting volunteers to the swing states, putting them up housing, giving them phones, giving them data. I think there's a lot of that. Again, in many respects, we're playing catch up to the Democrats on that. They have so much more financial resources, but I do think it's money well spent because it really comes down to the ground game in those swing states.
I mean, money aside, which is always handy, do you think it's a good thing, Greg, that Elon Musk supports Donald Trump? Do you think that's helpful?
I think it is, yeah, because for two reasons. One is he brings he's in a different lane than traditional Republican voters. He's younger, he's an immigrant, he's very successful, he's in sort of future looking businesses, and it's interesting to see. I think it points out something that should be obvious, but the people the Republicans that have come over to support Kamala Harris are really from, the old Republican Guard. They're from the past. This is the Cheney family from the 2000s, and it kind of reminds people of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's very yesterday. Barack Obama, who was elected, almost 20 years ago, two decades ago, 16 years ago. You've got Bill Clinton that was campaigning, major misstep on his part because he pointed out the sad death of Laken Riley in Georgia, and that will definitely help President Trump in Georgia. And so there's been some missteps, but they're all from politicians of the old days. And Elon Musk is a very future-looking person, between Tesla and, of course, SpaceX. He is a new generation. He's got an affiliation with crypto. So he's kind of a new, fresh face and very forward-looking. You could say the same with Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. Granted, he's older; he's in his 70s, or low 70s, but and from a legendary family. But it's more the things that he argues about: freedom of speech, censorship, vaccines, and some troubling things about nutrition and food ingredients. So these are all sort of new issues, new for Republicans, but also new for a lot of Americans. So it's an interesting contrast between, the Elon Musk endorsement and support versus Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Cheneys. It's a really interesting difference.
It is an interesting difference to have it laid out like that in that contrast. Look, it's good speaking to you always. Chair of Republicans,
Thanks, Rosanna.
Overseas UK, Greg Swenson.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by the former White House Director of Speechwriting to President Bill Clinton, David Kuznets. David, thank you very much for making time. And very simply, Kamala Harris's outing on Fox News, how do you think it went?
I think it went well. It showed that she is willing to go on media platforms that don't often host people with her point of view and speak to audiences who unfortunately don't get to hear her point of view. And it shows that she's running to be president of all Americans, not just of the Americans most likely to vote for her.
I mean, let's talk about how necessary it is for the candidates to do this, to go into unfriendly territory, if you like, because for Kamala Harris, it doesn't get much more unfriendly than Fox News, probably vice versa for Trump if he were to do MSNBC or similar. He's been courting, in fact, groups of voters that may not be amenable to him. It comes with risks, but it also comes with benefits, doesn't it? What part of the risk calculus is it?
That's right. I think the benefit is not only that the immediate audience gets to hear her make the case for herself, but also that a wider audience is aware that she did this and gives her points for courage and openness and for speaking to and for all Americans, not just part of the country.
Well, yes, she was asked whether she viewed Republican voters, Trump voters, as stupid, and she said, "I'd never speak that way about the American people." Was that a smart way to respond?
That's right. And that's in contrast with her opponent, who uses that word very often to describe people he disagrees with or is an adversary of.
Look, one of the big stated aims of this Fox News interviews was to try to win over conservative women, Republican women that wouldn't want to vote Kamala Harris. They didn't previously want to vote Hillary Clinton either, but they might not want to vote Donald Trump. So do you think she was successful in that?
Well, I think it's a good medium to reach Republican women who I think have growing doubts about Donald Trump. It may not be a mind changer, but it's a mind opener. And there are almost 3 weeks left for her to make the case to this audience and to other audiences.
In terms of getting her points across, though, because some people point out that Harris's weakness, or a lot of people point out that her weaknesses are that we don't really know what her policy points are on a number of things. Do you think that's getting clearer or stronger now?
I think it's getting clearer. People can go, for instance, people can go on her website and find a link to an 80-page economic program, which is pretty substantive. This is someone who does have a public record as district attorney in the Bay Area of California, as state attorney general in California, as a United States senator, and as vice president of the United States. So I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that she has no public record. And people have had the opportunity to follow her in real time, and now they can go on her website and listen to her and research her and learn a lot about her. I think she has a much longer public record in public office than the former president does. And she certainly has a longer public record than the Republican nominee for vice president, who has been a senator for 2 years.
Let's talk about the fact that Kamala Harris is trying to appeal to a Republican audience. That's normal at this point in an electoral race, that each side has to start appealing to what's known as the swing voters to try and win them over. But does it risk turning some of the Democrat voters off Harris, that they see her basically courting Republicans?
Well, I think the Democratic voters understand that she is running to be president of all of this country, which includes Republican voters. And I think most Democrats have Republican friends and family members and neighbors and coworkers. And I think the Democratic voters also understand that there are a lot of traditional Republican voters in this country, especially women, who do not see their own values reflected in Donald Trump, which I think explains why at a time when President Biden and former Presidents Obama and Clinton are campaigning for Kamala Harris, there are no former Republican presidents or vice presidents, and even very few members of Donald Trump's own cabinet, and even his own former vice president, who are campaigning for him. So I think that Kamala Harris's supporters understand that there are a lot of people who, in ordinary times with an ordinary nominee running against her, would not support Vice President Harris, but who in these times are opening their minds to supporting her. And I think they understand that the vice president is going to be saying and doing things that will first try to open minds and then try to change minds.
And that's something that audience members in Trump's Univision town hall seized upon and said, well, if Republicans are turning their back on you, then why should we back you? But also keen to point out that there have been defectors, of course, from the Democrats over to the Trump camp. We've seen Tulsi Gabbard, for one, RFK Jr. Some could even argue Elon Musk fits that category as well. Is that powerful for Trump?
I don't know that Elon Musk is or ever has been a Democrat. And as someone who is when I was much younger, really looked to Robert Kennedy Sr. as an example of what a public figure could be. I think it's understandable that RFK Jr. has had a very difficult time in his life, but it's sad that he's ended up in a place where I think every other member of his own family has repudiated him. And Tulsi Gabbard also is not in the mainstream of the Democratic Party and hasn't been for some time.
In terms of Harris trying to differentiate herself or come out sort of as her own woman, if you like, not in the Biden administration anymore, she's had to walk this difficult balance between deference to her former president, but also respect, but also saying, I'm going to be different, do things differently. Now, at a dinner party the other night, quotes out of President Biden saying she will cut her own path. Is that basically a tacit green light for her to go off and express herself freely?
I guess the short answer is yes. And I think we should keep in mind that that as president starting next year, she'll be serving in very different circumstances from what President Biden served. And President Biden took office after the insurrection on January 6th. It was still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, when there was remote work even in the White House, and he was dealing with a country that was in an economic crisis, a medical crisis, a political crisis, and a social crisis. And while there are, a lot of people are having a hard time now, it's nothing like the condition the United States was in on January 20th of 2021. So she'll be taking office in very different times. She's from a very different generation. She's a very different person. And of course she's going to be different.
I just want to ask you, while we've got you finally, given that you were a speech writer, so your thoughts are always about strategy and positioning and language. I'm sure you've talked plenty in the past about Trump and his use of language, but I want to talk to you about one phrase he's using continuously at the moment, which is the enemy within. It's not new, but he's actually been talking about it, saying the enemy from within is more dangerous than China and Russia at the moment. And to that, he sometimes indicates parts of the Democrat Party, people like Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff, calling them Marxists, communists and fascists. When you hear him use that type of language and framing it in that way, does it remind you of anything, or do you think it's clever strategy?
Doesn't remind me of anything that's been used by presidents or major party presidential nominees in the United States. I think you can go through the great presidents of both parties. You can go through two Roosevelts, Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and you never find that kind of language. You don't even find that kind of language with Abraham Lincoln describing people in the states that remained in the Union. He's famous for saying, with malice towards none and charity for all. He isn't famous for talking the way that Donald Trump has been talking. What is concerning is that while Donald Trump's rhetoric is not familiar in the United States of America, it is familiar in other countries that have been governed by autocrats of the left or right. I mean, you can find that language in a lot of countries that are where democracy has been under attack or where dictatorships have triumphed. You can't find that language in mainstream politics in either party in the United States of America.
Very interesting speaking to you, former Director of Speech Writing to President Bill Clinton, David Kusnert. That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye. Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Cairo, one of the world's greatest megacities, Cairo. It is rich in its historic finery, while at the same time known for its extremely hot weather, traffic, and yes, noise and air pollution. While it is perhaps the city that tourists both love and hate, the experience makes it rather worth the challenges. It's got history that spans centuries, the city is full of vigor, and Cairo is the place to be when you're looking to experience the Egyptian street life. It is, in fact, where the only surviving wonder of the ancient world is. No words can describe the majestic view of the three 5,000-year-old pyramids on the Giza Plateau. One of the most popular ones is the King's Chamber, considered one of the deepest man-made silences on Earth. Of course, you can't miss the Sphinx. It is both an enormous sight and an overwhelming experience you will never forget. It serves as the guard of the pyramids With its lion body and pharaoh face, it is certainly an iconic monument of the ancient world. You can take hours-long camel rides to get through the pyramids. Despite the heat, dust, and other hurdles while traveling, it is definitely worth it. The pyramids of Cheops, also called the Great Pyramid or the Pyramid of Khufu, is the largest pyramid of the Giza group. You can explore the mysterious interiors of its narrow passages. There's also the Solar Boat Museum behind it, where you will see the ceremonial solar barks that's amazingly been restored to its original glory. On the south, there's a Pyramid of Khafre, which is also known as the Pyramid of Khafre. It also has an internal tunnel that invites you to explore it. Finally, there's the smaller Pyramid of Mycerinus, or the Pyramid of Menkaure. When it comes to shopping, you must visit Khan el-Khalili, which is considered to have one of the world's greatest shopping experiences. Its narrow alleyways have been established since 1400 AD, and up to now is still up and about with all sorts of trade, from tiny stores to cluttered workshops. For sports and recreation, find tennis courts around the south of Jazeera or ride the stables at the sports club. The Cairo Tower, built in 1961 by President Nasser, offers you an amazing view of the sunset at its observation deck.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,